Tonight, we won't open dusty reports or count the diagnoses stamped in triplicate. Instead, we'll step into a corridor that hums under fluorescent light, the kind that doesn't flicker, it endures. A drawer slides, glass vials touch, a pencil on a string turns slightly as if it has something to add. The air smells faintly of antiseptic and paper, a mixture both clean and tired. Somewhere down the hall, a payphone exhales its steady breath, and for a moment you can't tell if the sound is mechanical or human. Here, calm is not silence. It's procedure. Help arrives as handwriting, as ink dried in neat rectangles, as advice delivered in a voice that memorized the tone of permission. The walls listen better than most people. So lower the lights. Let the quiet rhythm of filing and breathing align with your own. And if your pulse begins to match the steady hum of the corridor, that's already enough to belong here. Beyond that calm, the corridor waits long, pale, and evenly lit, as if the light itself has been trained to stand in line. Doors hum with quiet purpose. Each one knows its hour and its file. Somewhere, a drawer sighs open and a name begins its slow journey through paper. There is no rush here, only sequence. Every motion stamp, signature, shuffle seems to agree with the same unspoken rule, that order can be a form of mercy and stillness a kind of care. The corridor is quiet in that way only state buildings manage. Floors too clean, walls too serious, a clock that ticks like it was promoted. A fluorescent hum settles on everything like winter dust. Someone slides a card out from its sleeve and taps it twice on the counter the way bakers tap flour from a scoop. The tap is the sound of beginning. Rubber stamps fall like punctuation. Drawers sigh open and close, returning names to their alphabetical patients. The air smells of ink, paper, and disinfectant, an ordinary mixture that somehow carries the weight of care. Here, help begins with handwriting and waits for approval in triplicate. A pencil tied to the counter by string stands like a witness, quiet but indispensable. And as the first form is stamped, a story begins not of chaos or cure, but of order holding the mind steady for one more day. A visit begins with paper. Not because paper is interesting, but because paper decides where interest is allowed. The psychiatric dispensary, the psychonevrologic dispenser, greets you with a desk and a tray of numbered tickets that look like they once belonged to a well-behaved raffle. A file is created with your name, written a script that curls like steam from a kettle. The handwriting makes everything feel older than it is, as if the doctor had trained in a museum. The file includes a photo if you're unlucky and a glued-on slip that will one day trail the way luggage tags trail off a suitcase. Advice comes as a list so gentle it could be mistaken for a bedtime routine. Rest notes, early walks, warm milk, maybe a few supervised sunbaths in a sanatorium yard where the trees know not to gossip. Exercises are pinned to sleep, like breathe from the bottom and count your ribs, which is less alarming than it sounds and more like folding a towel carefully. Paperwork decides which door opens next because the door handles are connected to stamps, not hinges. A red stamp could be a gentle nudge toward a workplace break, or a heavier mark could slow your life in places you didn't plan licenses. Job applications, dormitory beds. The ink spreads into corners you never intended to visit, like tea creeping across the tablecloth. Every file has a tone. Some sing politely in pastel, others cough in black ink. There is the cost of a line in that file, and not just the queue you waited in to make it. The propiska, the internal residency permit, sits in the background like a landlord for your whole life in personnel offices, red health cards with the practical romance of weather reports. Scattered clouds, possible drizzle, carry an umbrella or a doctor's note. People learn small strategies as natural as taking your shoes off indoors. If you get referred locally, your supervisor might read along. If you can, You seek help through a clinic across town where no one knows your cousin's husband's supervisor. A friendly factory doctor becomes the neighbor with a spare key. The signature on the last page weighs both relief and risk in a precise ratio. Patients imagine scales. Clerks imagine shelves. Everyone uses tea. In the corridor, a payphone breeze, 2 kopecks slide down like a polite cough, and you tell your aunt you will be a little late because the nurse recommended air and you intend to take it. The routine is kind because routines are easier to justify than explanations. You will be asked how you sleep, which is a question with 100 answers and yet one acceptable length. Early, with interruptions, looks good in a margin and cannot offend. Appetite is a small science. The weight of a patient is magically both too much and not enough, like state secrets and winter coats. A doctor of large patients writes reactive state, like a weather system, and you feel strangely meteorological. In the waiting room, a poster displays a human nervous system colored in heroic oranges, as if the nerves were trying very hard to be cheerful. A nurse whispers that mineral baths help, and to be honest, mineral baths help most things that are not already underwater. The building has a smell everyone remembers and no one describes correctly. A mix of glass, paper, cotton, and something steamy that keeps threatening to become soup. Care you could touch often looked like a holiday written by an engineer. Sanatoriums were forests with timetables. You arrive with a slip that entitles you to walks, to soup, to a nap so official it could be audited. The day is divided the way a loaf is sliced, evenly with respect for the crust. Breakfast is an oatmeal democracy. After breakfast you breathe. Breathing is supervised by a woman who has been breathing professionally since the thaw and can spot an unserious inhale at 20 paces. The wind in the pines is an assistant therapist who works for free. You lie on a lounge that has seen generations of blankets. An orderly writes your name in a notebook where no one else will ever look and asks you please to read one chapter about cheerful labor. You are asked to take a walk so precise in length that it becomes a poem. To the bench, to the third birch, to the railing, back again. Pause for 2 geese to discuss your posture, continue. There are sports circles, dumb culture clubs, and the whole theory of psychological hygiene, a phrase that sounds like washing your thoughts in warm water and then pegging them to a line to dry. Workplaces adopt breaks with the seriousness of safety goggles. A rest cure fits alongside a production plan like a polite neighbor who only borrows sugar on scheduled days. And those clubs' language treads lightly. If words are heavy, they get replaced with chess. When moods are too bright, they are lent to the volleyball team standing very straight on a wooden floor that could be polished with pride alone. Recovery is a timetable, meals, naps, air, a page of reading, a lecture about proper posture during hope. None of this will surprise you if you have ever tried to fix a complicated machine by cleaning it thoroughly and tightening all the screws in symmetrical order. Improvement creeps in like a winter sunbeam moving along the radiator. It is slow and gentle and inclined to stop at the corner. There were quiet help channels that behave the way a neighbor does when you have locked yourself out. Businesslike, a little conspiratorial. Nothing will be mentioned to the superintendent. The telephone of trust rings longer than a friendship. Someone answers in a voice that could be any age. And you talk until the coin ends your sentence with a tiny metallic period. Librarians are prescription specialists. Here is a book with a dog that never fails to walk home correctly. Here is a poet who murmurs as if from under a blanket. In basements that smell of chalk, breathing circles meet and nobody makes a joke about it. Kitchen tables are small clinics where diagnosis is delayed until after dumplings. Windows open for late talk. The curtain takes notes. The teapot is an assistant social worker who pours over difficulties, 1 cup at a time. Community is a cushion when forms are sharp, and there are days when you hop from cushion to cushion like a child playing not to touch the floor. The diagnoses, drugs, and darker corners are in the same building but seem to keep their coats on. Neurasthenia strolls by in an overcoat with deep pockets. Reactive states sit like weather fronts between chairs. Alcohol dependence knows the route to the clinic better than some buses. Tranquilizers and antipsychotics share shelves like roommates who get along on labels if not on life. Treatment is a spectrum with one end tucked into sleep plans and walks, and the other disappearing into wards where keys turn, not quickly, but firmly. Some people visit monthly, the way you visit an elderly relative who prefers punctuality to conversation. Others stay long enough to make the rounds of the garden by season and to know which apple tree produced the most patient fruit. The goal on paper is function, a bed at night, and a place to stand by day. Small sentences like reliable steps. Between these lines, there runs a phrase that everyone knows and nobody wants to form in full Sikoshka. The word grows long and heavy, the way rumors learn to hibernate through strict winters. Locked words exist, and there are institutions that become symbols, which is not the same thing as becoming simple. Reports speak of misuse, labels stretched, diagnoses that look suspiciously like opinions in white coats, dissent mistaken for illness. Headlines form outside the gates because, inside, silence is a credential. Ethics has to find its voice through the fence, and it does, sometimes with strength, and sometimes in fragments that flutter like torn notices. Harm is documented. Ordinary care keeps running beside it, blandly and stubbornly, so close that the two histories sometimes share the same tram. If you ask their people how to tell them apart, you receive a diagram, a story, and a shrug. Each is right when held at the right angle. Drugs themselves are mild storytellers. A tablet promises calm with orientation preserved, which is like promising rain with sidewalks left dry. Doses are increased the way samovars are refilled, gradually and with hints of steam. A doctor's gesture becomes a whole paragraph. 2 fingers measuring, a pause such as you make before putting a letter into a slot, then a note in the margin, improved. Paper is a second stethoscope. Sleep becomes an ally when awake is too bright, and patients learn the art of midday darkness. Curtains close to the width of a postcard shoes placed nose to nose, the radio turned to a voice that reads until both of you forget the end. On charts, appetite and work form a pair like salt and bread. They are recorded as if they might elope if not watched. Visitors bring oranges that smell like better weather and newspapers that smell like the train. Alcohol gets its own clinic because it had already occupied many of the kitchens. Narcology is the medical word, though it feels like the name of a winter sport with no spectators. People line up quietly as if they were there to collect their courage by weight. There are codes, there are conditioned aversions, there are injections that promise a guard dog inside your bloodstream. The bottle is both cane and trapdoor. Families know corridor strategies. Remove keys without making a speech. Replace a shot glass with a tea glass. Keep kettles ready as if hydration were a hobby. And stand together in doorways, practicing the art of not letting a person pass their own worst decision. The clinics count dry days the way school children count the last week before summer. Small chalk lines that become a ladder. Relapses are described in the grammar of weather unfavorable conditions. Sudden fronts and successes are written in small, neat numbers that hang like medals in margins. There are group meetings where the jokes arrive with a little delay, but are appreciated for their effort. A man tells a room that he once gave vodka a pet name to make quitting feel like breaking up with someone. Everyone nods because everyone has been on both sides of that conversation. How people spoke about mental health publicly and privately is the most instructive thing of all. Pride prefers tired nerves to illness, and the phrase works like a warm scarf over a truth that's not ready to go out. Colleagues say overworked with the sincerity of a helpful label on a jar. A badge from a sanatorium sits in a photo album like a small medal for quietly continuing. You can tell which families have practiced crisis by their tea supplies. and which neighbors are good at listening by how their stairwell sounds at night, an occasional cough. A soft knock, never a slam. Progress is measured in sleep that stays and in plants that do not die on windowsills. People judge a month by whether they have enjoyed soup more than once. Winter walks lengthen the way pencils used to when you sharpen carefully, and everyone becomes an expert at looking out of windows in a productive manner. Words like psychotherapy arrive late to the party and are greeted politely, then given a stool near the stove to warm up. In many apartments, the surviving method is to talk through business, peel potatoes together, fold laundry together, move feelings around like neatly stacked towels. It works well enough to pass the time, which is nearly the same as passing through it. Meanwhile, those forms and files continue being the country's most constant novel, written in an uncompromising font. They tie health to work, to residence, to education, the way a patient shoelace holds an entire afternoon together. A heavy mark in the wrong place can slow a job change or make a driver's license feel like an ambitious dream. People become skilled at playing the accordion of disclosure, one note for the doctor, a different note for the director, a third very soft note for the relative who always asks in the wrong tone. You tell the truth on even days and hope the calendar has mercy. The cost of a file is therefore not money but friction, a bit like wearing wool, warm, useful, and occasionally too much. Inside clinics, the humor is dry and helpful. A nurse straightens a pile of charts and remarks that paper gets more rest than any of us. A doctor explains side effects by describing a neighbor's cat, mostly calm, sometimes dignified, rarely dangerous, just don't run. Someone insists that chamomile is more effective if you do not watch it steep. If a ward has a television, it may be tuned to a concert in which the conductor appears to be boiling the orchestra gently. A patient claims the mineral water tastes like well-behaved electricity. None of this solves anything, which is exactly why it is so excellent at helping. Not all treatment looks medical. In village clubs, there are lectures about labor and mood in which a man with very fine chalk writes the word restoration, as if carving it into marble. In factories, brigades get lectures on psychological hygiene, and everyone assumes this means the right number of breaks and no arguments with equipment. Workers practice breathing behind machines that breathe louder. A woman in a headscarf teaches a room to stand up straight and to believe this will improve thought circulation. It is analog cognitive therapy: straighten, sip, step outside, return. If you are expecting the tools of a modern clinic, couches, inward journeys, tropes from novels, you might be surprised to find instead a very respectable schedule, a coach with a stop near the forest, and a stack of towels. The debate about misuses never ceases completely. It is like a second soundtrack, sometimes loud, sometimes a faint record playing in another room. You hear of cases where a diagnosis leaps across the gap from health to politics, like a well-trained goat. And you hear of doctors who fight that leap with footnotes, and of others who assist it with practice pens. In the same city, perhaps on the same tram line, a person receives careful help for grief while another is labeled beyond their consent. Outsiders compile reports, insiders write rebuttals. Lawyers learn new verbs. The ethical questions grow tall and lean over the fence until even the sun must bend around them. And yet, even here, someone must deliver meals on time. Someone must refill the disinfectant. Someone must notice whether the geraniums by the south window have been watered. Ordinary care, when it is real, requires ordinary hours. It's not right to let that be eaten by abstraction, and not right to let abstraction be eaten by routine. The record remains complicated enough to hold no single sentence without a few more on either side. The language of recovery remains small and practical. A good week is a page written in the margin with the same pencil that marks cucumbers for pickling. Doctors prefer the verb stabilize, which feels like putting wedges under a slightly wobbly table, an action with domestic dignity. Friends ask whether you have been breathing and understand that this means a place with trees and benches and a fence low enough to step over if you wish, though nobody does. In a cupboard somewhere, there is a stack of certificates attesting to completion of a course in health. They are mostly beige, with a border of quiet enthusiasm. People keep them next to their school diplomas, and in the late afternoon light, the two papers nod to each other from across the years. When the day is over, the drawer receives the file again with a sluggish slide, the way snow gives way to a tram line. The light in the corridor keeps humming. Somewhere a payphone inhales and waits. And in a kitchen, a kettle begins to consider boiling, then changes its mind and waits for the hand that will make it official. We close the drawer, but not the subject. The phone at rest, but not the listening. The city put to bed with a blanket of street lamps that switch on one by one like careful promises. If you are still awake, count the stamps, or the benches, or the times a nurse says nothing special, and means, in a quiet, competent way, that your life will continue on a schedule soft enough to lean on. Keep leaning. The corridor is long, but the floor is warm, and the night is practiced at holding small noises until morning. You might not expect a rectangle of glass, a handful of 2 kopeck coins, and a printed directory chained to a shelf to explain how society talked to itself, but they do. The public payphone booth, the box that looked faintly embarrassed about standing in the snow, tells a slow, steady story. It begins with a click you could feel in your teeth, continues with a breath of dial tone that sounded like a seashell trying to be a train, and ends with a receiver hung up firmly enough to feel like closure. If you're still awake by the time we get to the part where people warm their hands over the hidden electric heater, feel free to subscribe or don't. In the tradition of the payphone, I can wait politely while the coin drops at its own speed. The booth's design was modest and confident, like an overachieving cupboard. Some were open pedestals with no walls, just a sturdy metal column and a phone that looked ready to outlive several governments. Others were glass houses of conversation, the panes taped at the corners where life had bumped them too often. The door, when there was one, knew to clang. Inside, every surface had a job. The little shelf held a notepad that started the day with a stubby pencil and ended the day with a graceful absence. The phone book, heavy and municipal, hung under a chain that implied both trust and experience. People flipped its thin pages with a delicacy usually reserved for pastry. The handset had a coiled cord that could have served as an emergency slinky. Coins fit the slot with a manufactured destiny, 2 kopecks for a local call, though many machines understood the language of ingenuity-stacked coins, shaved coins, a well-timed cough. The coin box inside was a square stomach that burped only for technicians. Winter treated the booth kindly. The roof collected snow like a hat. Someone had thought about condensation. A strip of felt along the frame prevented windows from crying too loudly. The floor evolved a map of the city made from footprints. In certain neighborhoods, the phone wore a crocheted cozy around the metal handle in January, knitted by no one in particular. The dial, when there was a dial, turned with a speed anyone could learn in a week. Not too fast, not too slow like stirring porridge you genuinely respect. Waiter keypads arrived and pretended to be modern. They still sounded like polite machinery. The dial tone itself was a promise and a threat. You lifted the receiver and the booth inhaled significantly. Whole lives were organized by the length of that inhale. Between the person and the person they wanted lay an architecture most people never saw, but everyone felt. Exchanges hummed like beehives and were staffed by operators who could route a call, with the elegance of ballet and the patience of a librarian. Local connections walked across town on copper legs, while long distance had its own ritual named Mesdegordni, a word like a hallway. To call another city, you visited a window with a form, then went home and waited for the phone on your wall to ring back at whatever hour fate deemed appropriate. The system had its own weather. Lines were busy in a way that felt less like congestion and more like the city politely excusing itself. If you listened closely, you could hear crosstalk, a birthday wish drifting through at the edge of your news about potatoes. It gave every conversation the faint glamour of espionage. Somewhere a switchboard with blinking eyes followed procedure exactly. Somewhere a technician with a key that looked like a silver tooth opened the belly of the machine and harvested the day's coins into a leather sack that smelled like arithmetic. Etiquette inside a booth was its own soft law. You did not lean your whole weight against the glass unless the call was about love or the train schedule. Then you could lean. You turned slightly toward the wall for privacy, as if this were a ritual known to mirrors. You spoke in the register appropriate for streets, not confession, not announcement street tone, which is almost a whisper with opinions. If the person you needed lived in a building with an intercom, you gave their apartment number to a doorman who remembered everything and forgot it as needed. The queue outside the booth had a shape like a comma. It curved to suggest patience but maintained the punctuation of turn-taking. A stranger might ask whether you were long, and you would answer honestly, because there is no point lying to time. Children used the booth for their first solo phone calls and acquired an adult voice for exactly 40 seconds. Elderly men approached like diplomats, produced a folded piece of paper from a hat, and dialed with the seriousness appropriate to passports. Wives telephoned husbands at factories whose sirens had already told the neighborhood what time it was. Students used the phone to confirm that the key was indeed under the sugar bowl. You could hear the clink of spoons from other apartments coming through like distant sleigh bells. Because technology likes ceremonies, the coin had stages. You inserted it with a slide and a blink. Somewhere inside, a lever measured its sincerity. If the call did not connect, the phone spit your coin back with a little metallic apology. If the call did connect, you could sometimes persuade the phone to return the coin anyway, a magic trick performed by those who knew how to listen for the exact vibration of destiny. Certain machines had reputations. That one keeps money, someone would warn, as if the phone had started a savings plan. Others were saints and gave back change the way fountains grant wishes. The economy of phones was small but fierce. People planned errand routes that touched favorite booths. If a storm knocked out power, the booth-yard's clusters of phones near tram stops became islands of story. A person with news could speak once, then repeat the conversation to the next person in line, and then again, until the news smoothed into a well-behaved narrative. The booth had no interest in rumors, but it couldn't stop rumors from taking excellent notes. There was a sound, the rhythmic click of rotary return, that shows up in memory the way the smell of peelable paint shows up in stairwells. It timed sentences. People learned to do small things between numbers, adjust a scarf, check the ceiling for historical cracks, read the tiny municipal warning that said you were responsible for damage in a way that wasn't too credible. Even waiting had texture. The glass fogged in winter and recorded temporary hieroglyphs. Draw a heart, draw it again when it evaporates, except that ephemerality is very tidy. In summer, the booth grew warm and honest. Wedding parties used the phone to check whether the restaurant had indeed remembered the third cake without raisins. On May Day, garlands sometimes crossed wires. If you said hello, the parade said hello back. The network was also a calendar. Weekdays did one thing to the dial tone. Sundays did another. On New Year's Eve, the whole city called the whole city, and the dial tone tried very hard to be brave. When the national time signal beeped on the radio, many callers instinctively paused, as if the booth might need a second to catch up with astronomy. In remote stations, the phone stood inside the post office like an additional employee who never took lunch. The postmistress knew whose calls would be long enough to justify a stool, and whose conversations would be so short they could be conducted standing, like a polite scolding. Telegrams and payphones had a relationship like cousins who share an aunt. You used one when you had failed to plan the other. Arrive Thursday, stop bring cheese could be created at a counter, and then, panicking about the cheese, you relayed a clarification through the booth so that no one misinterpreted cheese as metaphoric. Some booths were sociable. They stood near kiosks that sold newspapers and sunflower seeds, and the ground around them glittered with shells that made a sound like distant rain. Other booths were solitary figures in courtyards where laundry lines wrote long sentences in cotton. The solitary booths had personality, one kind to children, one stern with everyone, one resigned to its fate as a place where teenagers practiced sincerity. There were also the indoor telephones in factories and hospitals, protected by authority and available if you could locate a person with keys, which meant finding the right door and an explanation with good posture. The indoor receivers were heavier, like important bread. You could feel policy in them. A booth could be both public square and confessional. A man on night shift called at 2:07 to hear his newborn breathe. That was the whole point of the call. The breathing was the entire content. And then he told the dusted street that he was a father, and the street made room for his news the way tram lines make room for early snow. An aunt with a voice like warm wool called 4 phone numbers in sequence because information moved along cousins like electricity across damp rope. A schoolgirl learned the ritual of "I will call you at 5," and then learned the greater ritual of "I will try again at 5:30, and by this she entered history. Sometimes couples invented code in case the connection misbehaved. "Is the kettle on?" meant "I miss you." "The cat is a bureaucrat" meant "do not say more until I knock on the door." It was not necessary to have a cat for this to be meaningful. Because this is a history of small absurdities, we should mention that some people kept personal lists of all the booths that reliably connected to out-of-town numbers faster than the ones near post offices. The lists had annotations: "best after rain," "coin jar often full and generous," "do not tell Sasha." Repairmen, who traveled with toolkits like serious handbags, could listen to a phone and nod as if diagnosing a piano. They climbed inside the box with a screwdriver and a look of fatherly disappointment. When they finished, the dial tone sounded like it had recently confessed and felt better. The city owned spare parts that were older than some grandmothers but still fit. Long-distance calls were arranged the way you set up eclipses. You filed a request and then lived as if nothing would happen because nothing might. Hours later, the connection arrived like a guest with impeccable timing and no apology. The phone on your wall rang in a tone that you knew belonged to faraway places. You picked up and held your breath because breath is expensive at inner-city rates. The operator asked in a kind voice whether you were indeed you, and then the far city arrived inside your kitchen with a little echo. Families spoke in telegram grammar at first, then in full sentences when they remembered they were people. Some households put the phone on the table so the entire extended family could take turns saying the same 6 phrases. It was as efficient as it was joyful. When the line clicked in the middle and died, nobody took it personally. The world was vast, and telephone cables were just skinny bridges built by optimistic ants. Emergencies had their own soundtrack. Someone ran to the phone with a scarf tied not quite correctly and tried not to explain too fast. The person on the other end asked simple questions about complicated things. A passerby offered coins because emergencies tend to summon the right kind of generosity. The ambulance arrived, and its siren harmonized with the payphone's busy signal, which is the kind of duet cities practice in their sleep. Afterwards, someone remembered to return the scarf to dignity. The booth, which had participated with full seriousness, returned to being a glass box that smelled faintly of electricity and excuses. After hours, the payphone led a second life. Teenagers who had learned guitar chords by persistence stood beside it and used the reflective glass to adjust their seriousness. Night watchmen made rounds that intersected with the booth because all respectable routes do. In deep winter, faint warmth gathered around the base, and you could see in the snow the cautious footprints of citizens who knew this secret. Cats tried to occupy the shelf and were often forgiven. There were rumors of a phone that, if you dialed all zeros, played the national time signal only louder. People tried this 3 times, just to be certain. It did nothing special, which is a kind of relief. In the outskirts, booths were anchors. Buses consulted them and adjusted their self-esteem. The phone stood between the bakery and the notice board where apartments for exchange were listed like chess puzzles. A person could leave a message with the baker for the person who would use the booth after lunch, and the baker would deliver it with buttered authority. When holidays came, paper garlands tangled briefly in the receiver and were removed with an apology to the future. On election days, someone cleaned the glass so thoroughly that for a moment it seemed the booth had shed its skin. On Victory Day, veterans telephoned former comrades and called each other by surnames that tasted like iron and memory. The phone held those calls like a bowl. When private telephones multiplied and mobile ones began to cross the city like migrating birds, the payphones thinned. The booths grew self-conscious. Some lost their doors and turned into metal lecterns for announcements about dance classes. Others survived by becoming landmarks and directions. Turn left at the phone that refuses to die. A few were retired to museums where their dial tones are now recorded and played on command to visitors who close their eyes and are instantly somewhere colder and kinder. The rest find work in dreams where you suddenly need to call someone and the number appears under your hand and the coin you don. Do you remember acquiring slides into the slot like a decision you were proud of? It is useful to remember that among the repeating parts of ordinary life and cues qualify as highly repeatable, there was this quieter instrument that met strangers all day and kept their secrets tolerably well. The phone requested almost nothing: a coin, a number, a minute, a promise to hang up gently. In return, it gave you access to someone else's kitchen, their echoes, their weather, their news that the cat had finally learned how doors work. The machine worked with such regular humility that nostalgia is tempted to exaggerate it. Let us resist and instead respect the booth for what it was: a small, reliable bridge, friendly with snow, strong with simple circuitry, wearing misdemeanors like badges, stubbornly present at the edge of every serious errand. The etiquette did not write itself. People rehearsed it by standing in line together. While waiting, no one stood completely still. You rocked on your heels, made a list on the back of a bus ticket, held your shopping bag like a small dog watched tram windows to guess whether the caller inside was buying beets for soup or flowers for apology. The line's conversation traveled at the speed of good manners. You always offered your turn to someone whose worry arrived already dressed for the occasion. If you were that person, you accepted only once. The coin lent itself across hands as neutrally as mathematics. Take, take, an old man would say, and somehow you never forgot that he had said exactly that to the exact spot in the air where your palm had been. Phones learn stories even when we don't tell them aloud. Consider the student who phoned home to say that she had been assigned a bed in a dormitory she had not requested but was already learning to like. She paused between digits 4 and 5 to smile at the lies she was not telling. Consider the factory worker who phoned the theater to ask if any ticket had found itself alone, a phrase unintentionally poetic, then stood outside the booth rehearsing how to clap with something like restraint. Consider the grandmother who called the uncle to insist that the child did not need a new hat yet, and then dialed the neighbor to announce joyfully that the child was getting a new hat. Phones accept contradictions. They are built for them. Ask any switchboard. The end of a call contains one of the quietest satisfactions available to humans: the clean metal clack of receiver meeting cradle. It is a punctuation mark that even shy people enjoy. In some cities, the booths faced one another across the sidewalk so that two lives could begin and end simultaneously with matching clacks, like two doors closing gently in a cordial apartment building. Afterwards, the dial tone returned to being a small domestic ocean inside the handset, and the booth resumed watching weather. People left. Coins hibernated. The directory turned its own pages slowly, practicing. If you keep listening, you will notice that the booth speaks in present tense even now. An electrician somewhere compares the sound of a good connection to the taste of a new battery. A historian writes that a lack of private lines created a surplus of shared narrative, which is the kind of sentence that sounds like a grant application and also happens to be true. A child finds an old phone on a wall in a stairwell that smells of cabbage and chalk and asks where the send button is. The building laughs in plaster. And somewhere on a street that has not changed enough to notice, a surviving payphone still breathes. The glass fogs. A coin makes a thoughtful descent. And the voice that answers says hello in exactly the same way people used to. Which is to say, as if they are ready to help you carry something down the stairs if that is what you need. So if you are still awake, you can count the clicks of a rotary dial, or the number of snowflakes resting on a booth's thin roof, or try to remember the weight of a 2-kopeck coin lighter than an argument, heavier than an apology. The city is quieter now, but the old phones are patient memories. When you fall asleep, they will keep standing in the dark, reflecting small squares of street lamp on their glass, waiting with the particular kindness of objects, designed for strangers sure that when you return, you will know the number by heart. You might not expect a paper file with a string loop, a rubber stamp that squeaks a little, and a nurse who remembers. You're dressed by the sound of your last name to map a whole world of feelings, but they do. The mental health system of a very tidy country begins in a corridor that smells faintly of disinfectant and pencil, where doors line up like polite ideas. If you're still awake by the time the stamp dries, you can subscribe or not. We will be here either way, counting the pages together in a whisper a clerk would approve of. The morning starts at a registration desk with a lamp that throws a circle of bureaucracy on the countertop. You present a passport if you have one, or a note from your clinic if you don't, and are rewarded with a card the exact color of old oatmeal. The receptionist writes carefully, looped letters like knitwear, and somewhere inside a wooden cabinet, a drawer size open to accept your file. A psychoneurology dispenser, 6 syllables walking information, assigns you to a doctor, not unlike a librarian assigning a book to a shelf where it will be found. There's a ticket with 2 lines, the date, which is patient, and the room number, which is certain. You keep it flat so it will not curl into mischief. The office door has frosted glass, and behind it the doctor's routine is precise and soothing. Quiet questions make a calm ladder: sleep, appetite, headaches, work. A blood pressure cuff stages its gentle squeeze that always feels like a small, professional hug, and a ballpoint pen clicks twice as if to say, yes, we are beginning. Care travels by paper. Advice is written as instructions you could pin to the wall of an orderly mind. Take a walk in the evening breeze. As shown in the diagram, imagine the body as a well-run workshop where every tool returns to its peg. If a sanatorium is recommended, there is a blue slip that looks suspiciously like a travel document, promising minerals and naps. The doctor underlines words that matter, not with drama but with duty, and stamps the bottom with a round seal that makes everything official the way a moon makes tides. As you leave, the nurse adds your next visit to a calendar whose squares look like empty plates waiting for lunch. In the corridor, a payphone breathes on the wall, in case you need to call work and tell them you'll be late. The hospital understands that schedules are patient when stamped properly. A file is also a passport between rooms. Propiska, the permit that decides where you officially exist, speaks quietly to the file, and the file answers like a polite relative. This person lives here, at this address, on the 4th floor with the taller of the 2 birches outside. Serious decisions hide in the handwriting. A single line can slow a job transfer or speed a dormitory application. People know this without saying it, the way one knows that a line at the bread kiosk means evening will smell nice. Some travel across town to a clinic where the questions feel friendlier or where the friend of a friend has a lighter stamp. Others confide in a factory doctor who shares tea in thick glasses and prescribes exercise disguised as physiological hygiene. The cost of a signature is measured in future doors that open without a squeak. The day continues like a well-behaved train. You take home pamphlets that treat health as a series of agreeable chores. Air your room, walk 20 minutes, avoid late potatoes, sit straight while reading the newspaper about hydropower. There is a list of exercises that look like choreography for someone who trusts chairs. The official tone is comforting because it has no surprises. Your file now has the weight of a sandwich, and when you slide it back to the receptionist, she stores it with the others in a cabinet that resembles an apartment block. Every little metal label a doorbell. In the evening, the corridor quiets. The janitor folds a rag with ceremony, and the stamp rests in its saucer like a turtle in its pond. That is the first scene. Paperwork as architecture, documents as a patient compass pointing from one door to the next, through rooms where pens mark the way like small, reliable constellations. Between paper and rest lies care you can touch, baths that smell like the sea in a building that looks like a school gymnastic halls with windows. Tall enough to make the sky feel included benches at the edge of forests where the wind practices long sentences. Sanatoriums flourish on postcards. Their long verandas and striped blankets promise naps that obey the clock. You arrive with a suitcase that squeaks and are assigned a routine that has already learned your name. Morning begins with a cup and a schedule. Mineral water arrives in serried glasses, each the size of an argument you did not intend to have. There are walks on wide paths where the gravel plays music under shoes. The nurse calls the daily exercises charging, and everyone smiles because it is unclear whether it charges bodies or the day itself. After lunch, which is often soup with croutons arranged like punctuation, you nap. The bedspread is a color chosen by a committee that loves pastels. You wake gently, as if the entire building has agreed not to startle you. Factories and offices borrow this logic under the name of work hygiene. Lights are measured carefully. Breaks are scheduled like honest holidays. Bulletin boards show men in singlets raising dumbbells in a manner that makes you believe the dumbbells have papers. Sports circles and dom culture clubs tidy the mind by occupying the body. Lap lanes, chessboards, dance steps that masquerade as civic pride. Those who feel language is heavy can stand in a circle and talk about fishing. The world will understand. Recovery is a timetable whose boxes you get to fill with small achievements. Took a walk, watered a plant, read 2 pages, slept before midnight. The doctor nods as though you have cleverly answered a difficult riddle. Outside the institutions, help travels by softer roads. A telephone of trust in a city building listens longer than a neighbor can. The number is printed in careful black on posters that also promote concerts, as if Beethoven and confidentiality belong to the same category. Librarians, those secular saints of quiet, recommend books with plots like calm rivers, a chapter for every tea. In church basements, breathing circles meet among chalk dust and folding chairs. The room is selected for poor acoustics so that sighs do not sound like speeches. In kitchen corners, where the window is always just a little open, people talk into the long night with the mischievous seriousness of those who accept that whispered opinions are a form of national sport. The table learns everyone's elbows, the radiator ticks approval, and the city outside runs like a watch that has already been wound. When forms feel sharp, community acts as cushion, acquaintances pop out like spare screws from a drawer, each one the exact right thread for whatever is loosening today. Diagnoses, when they arrive, behave like furniture. They take up space, they are moved around, they are covered with a cloth when guests come. The spectrum begins where sleeplessness meets responsibility, neurasthenia, that beautiful antique word meaning my nerves are writing memos. Reactive states sit nearby and are exactly what they sound like. Feelings reacting to life, as lit matches react to air. Alcohol dependence, which the system calls by its first name and official voice, has a room of its own with windows that open more often. Tranquilizers and antipsychotics live in blister packs like neat little neighborhoods. They are offered with the same tone used for vitamin C and winter boots. Practical, widespread, expected to do their job. Sleep plans are discussed with the gravity of train timetables. You are asked about appetite, about the weather inside your head, about whether you can stand at your post between breakfast and lunch. The goal on paper is modest and therefore ambitious. A bed at night, a place to stand by day. In a system that admires function, the ability to water a plant becomes a kind of medal. In the corner, though, is a word that is less clinical and more haunted, sikuka. It begins as slang for locked wards and grows into a rumor with a passport. Stories circulate, at once whispered and widely known, of labels stretched until they fit dissent, of diagnoses that expand for political wins, of special institutes where ethics come up for air less frequently than they should. Some of this becomes fact with documents. Some of it becomes headache with no paperwork at all. Newspapers mention things by not mentioning them. Everyone is fluent in omission. Truth, being meticulous, arrives in fragments. A court document here, a testimony there, a committee of doctors later, signatures that agree harm occurred, ordinary care that simultaneously continues down the hall with its polite stamps and sanatorium slips. The debate knots the tongue, not because vocabulary is lacking, but because the corridor is narrow and two trolleys cannot pass at once. Even in the argument, the system keeps its manners. This can be soothing, and it can be alarming, like a train that arrives exactly on time to the wrong station. Narcology has its own doorway, marked by a line that moves slowly but often arrives where it said it would. Long winters lean on vodka like a cane, and people lean back. Clinics offer the familiar trinity of code, aversion, and group. The code is a ritual, medical, and theatrical. A doctor explains consequences with a voice like a clean blade, and the patient nods with a seriousness previously reserved for oaths. Aversion is science with a frown, training the body to disagree with what the heart insists it wants. Groups count days as if days were beads. They pass a cup of tea like a secular chalice. Families at home learn corridor strategies, remove keys that jingle in pockets, hide bottles in plain sight by replacing them with jam, boil tea until the kettle sounds like a lecture, stand together as if practicing for a photograph. Each quiet week earns an entry in a small notebook where someone writes, slept, ate, laughed, the 3-seed recipe for a garden that grows if the windows are opened every morning. Language, meanwhile, is its own physician. People prefer tired nerves to illness, the way one prefers a light jacket to admitting it is cold. A person is overworked, out of sorts, knocked by weather. Euphemism is less a lie than a blanket. Metaphors do errands. A brain is a fuse box. A mood a neighbor who can be convinced to turn down the radio. A panic a bird that will leave if you open the window. A badge from a sanatorium, threadbare ribbon, stamped metal. The date like a little coin sits in a family album, right next to a photograph of a picnic by a lake where everyone wore hats. Progress is measured in the most practical metrics. Sleep that stays, work that holds, walks that lengthen around the block like elastic, appetite that returns to the plate as calmly as a spoon to its drawer. You would not call it heroism, but the word routine begins to sound noble, which, if you think about it long enough, it is. If you're still awake, here is a small curiosity from a waiting room. On the wall is a poster with a breathing exercise diagram, and somewhere deep in the background, a radio reads the hourly time signal. Pip, 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 peep. Patients pause mid-inhale to acknowledge astronomy. A woman folds a scarf exactly 3 times and puts it on the back of a chair that has never been colder than medium. A man reads the same paragraph twice from a magazine with an article on potatoes that somehow manages to be both practical and philosophical. A child counts the tiles, which allows the lungs to figure themselves out without attention. Micro miracles happen in such rooms, but they are so small they do not offend the janitor, who has a schedule. The system is not simple, but it is organized, and organization can cradle a person who needs to sit down. You learn which door has the friendliest handle, which nurse will tell a joke involving thermometers, which corridor is good for practicing optimism at a moderate pace. You also learn what not to say out loud to certain forms, and which words are best saved for the kitchen where the kettle understands. It is a choreography of caution and care. Some people live their whole lives inside its rhythm and find it acceptable, like rain that keeps its promises. Others push against it and bruise where paperwork sticks out too far from the desk. Most manage like experienced shoppers in a familiar store. They know which aisle has compassion next to bandages, and which cashier will look at them as if they are both ridiculous and beloved. The night watchman at a clinic might tell you that the building sleeps well. He walks his rounds and notes that the file cabinet has the contentment of a cow. He knows the smell of the disinfectant, lemon with ambition, and he likes that the clock in the main hallway is 5 minutes fast because it makes everyone feel early. If a light flickers, he gives it a fatherly stare and it thinks better of misbehaving. He talks to the plants. The plants prefer not to talk back. Sometimes he sees a patient sitting on a bench in a coat, practicing a speech for tomorrow's appointment that contains the sentence, "It is a little better," repeated like prayer beads. The watchman nods to the sentence as if it's a person. The sentence nods back. There's no dramatic ending to a system that keeps being itself. Doors keep opening, files keep growing heavier, and then being replaced by newer, lighter ones because eventually someone invented a different kind of folder. Winter continues to be long in a way that makes hot tea taste like competence. The bottle continues to tempt, like an uncle who tells good stories and bad advice. Sanatoriums modernize their paint. The telephone of trust updates its number and, very politely, asks posters to be refreshed. Doctors retire and are replaced by other doctors who inherit chairs and a collection of pens and improvised glass. The city learns new adjectives for old feelings and keeps some of the old ones because they fit like slippers. We close the drawer gently with the file inside, and the corridor hum returns to the pitch that says nothing urgent is currently happening, which is as close to peace as a building gets. Outside, the pavement is swept in arcs people find inexplicably calming. A trolley bus takes the corner like a large, thoughtful animal. Someone at a window waters a plant exactly on schedule, not because the plant will perish without it, but because schedules make kind scaffolding. If you drift off now, the stamp can dry without you, and the nurse will keep the appointment card flat under a paperweight shaped like a ship. When you wake, the doors will still be lined up, the glass will still glow, and the city will still be ready with a mixture of caution and care, one signature at a time. You might not expect a city asleep to depend on one person with a key the size of a small submarine and a pocket that smells faintly of oil. But that is how many towns learned what time it was. Up a narrow stair, along a beam where pigeons conduct their own meetings, a clockwinder carried a lantern and a patience that never hurried. If you're still awake by the time we get to the part about the spare springs wrapped in cloth like sandwiches, you can subscribe or not. The tower will keep ticking either way, and so will I, at a comfortable pace that would please the gears. The day for a clockwinder began when most days ended for everyone else. There was a book, usually. It was kept in a drawer that stuck slightly, an innocent form of security. Inside, tidy columns recorded windings as if they were harvests. Monday, 8 turns, weather damp. That was slightly sulky. Some towns used weights that dropped through the week like very polite elevators. Others relied on springs the size of cinnamon buns, tightened with a crank that had a handle polished by a century of solitary optimism. The key fit into a square arbor, and when you turned it, there was that particular satisfaction metal, greedy metal, resistance that yielded, the way a stubborn jar lid behaves for the third person trying. A good winder felt the temper of the mechanism through the palms. If it resisted too cheerfully, something was wrong. If it flowed like warm syrup, all was well. Microhook, one winder in Dorset noted. Wednesday, turned while Cat supervised from pendulum shelf. Cat gave no opinion. Tools arrived in a basket rather than a toolbox. There would be a duster that was never clean again, a bottle labeled clock oil in handwriting that looked mid-19th century no matter the decade, a wedge of leather for silencing tiny rebellions, and chalk for marking temporary promises on dark metal. Gloves were optional. Many winders trusted bare hands, claiming they could hear with their fingertips. They spoke to their clocks in short sentences. Steady. No showing off. We aim for noon, not fame. If something squeaked, the winder listened as though determining whether the sound was philosophical or mechanical. Whale oil, later paraffin, later something nicer to whales, rode up in small flasks tucked into socks against the cold. A lantern made all gears into planets. Dust, once disturbed, settled on the winder's shoulders like a thin promotion. The tower had its own climate. In winter, the ropes felt like frozen snakes. In summer, the wood smelled of pine and pigeon dignity. Steps were uneven in the polite way old steps are. They warned you by being themselves. Halfway up, a door led to a room full of bell, a presence rather than an object. The bell had a name locally, usually a woman's name or something agricultural. Matilda, Great Kate, the barley. The winder greeted it as one greets a large old horse, with sincerity and a hint of apology. If repairs called for silence, a wooden plug was wedged in the hammer, as throat so the bell would only think its notes instead of broadcasting them to laundry lines across the district. Below, shopkeepers set watches by the chime, and school children counted bongs, as if each one shortened algebra by a minute. If the bell hesitated or sang twice at once because of a mischievous rebound, the town would tilt slightly in confusion for an afternoon, like a hat worn a degree off center. Once the weights were lifted to their starting lines rope coiled obediently, pulleys tilting their heads, the winder visited the escapement. This tiny diplomat, all tick and talk and even-handedness, decided the pace of civic life. A pendulum rod, often wooden once, later temperature compensated with a bit of vanity, swung in a patient arc. It did not forgive drafts. Winders learned to stuff gaps with rags, or documented in one municipal note, old scarf of previous winder, brown. A stray sparrow could upset a week. In coastal towns, salt air taught brass humility. In mill towns, lint tried to unionize in the pinions. The winder's brush evicted it with polite firmness. Somewhere, a visiting dignitary would always ask if the clock ran on electricity now. The answer for decades was, only when we are insulted, which meant only when the spring snapped and the town hired an electrician in a hurry. If the afternoon belonged to taverns and market stalls, the late evening belonged to the tower. The winder returned with a pocket sandwich and a moral attitude toward crumbs. Lantern light made a slow concert of shadows, the escape wheel, the governor fan for striking like a tiny windmill that never moved townsfolk, but did move time, the chain. The drum, the number someone once filed on a tooth to correct a youthful arrogance of speed. A micro-absurdity. One 1880s note reports a parcel from Birmingham containing 3 extra minutes. which meant 3 new teeth for an hour wheel, racked as carefully as if they were newborns. Laughter allowed in the logbook, briefly, then back to rhythm. Every tower had its private jokes with weather. Fog made sound thick and late. Frost made ropes complain in a dialect of crackle. During storms, the bell struck with a dampened conviction, as if it didn't want to bother the clouds. Winders learned to read the town by the echo from the square, the market tents, the brick walls, the river. They also learned that pigeons can be unimpressed by history. One winder carried peas to distract them. Threw parley to pigeons, he wrote. Perhaps he meant parsley. It worked anyway. People looked up from barrows of apples, adjusted their scarves, and said, "That'll be 5 to the hour. The pie can stay in the oven 2 more bongs." In this way, clocks supervised pastry. The bell rope had cousins, lines that connected hammers to hours and quarters. Some towers boasted tune mechanisms barrels with pins like mechanical music boxes, promising a hymn on market day and a secular tune on Mondays to avoid complaint. Winders were part-time composers, moving pegs a hole left or right to keep the melody mildly fresh, the way a baker alternates which shelf gets the best heat. In a small city, the quarter chimes were as trusted as a calendar. People could buy fish at the 3rd quarter and still cross to the post at the hour. Late in the 19th century, engineers argued over which sequence of notes best honored arithmetic. Westminster won often, but local variations hung on like dialect words, pleasing, defensible, and very sure they were right. There were famous mishaps, which is to say, small disasters that made excellent bedtime stories. A winder in northern France reportedly fell asleep on a bench between the 2nd and 3rd weights, convincing the town it was both almost 9 and not quite 12 for a confusing 15 minutes. In a Swiss village, daylight saving arrived by postcard and left by law with only the clock to mediate. The winder dutifully put the hour in a teacup behind the dial and restored it in October, a joke that outlived him by 2 generations. In Boston, the Commons clock once ran backward after a lightning strike, which made geese appear early in the park's shallow lake, and schoolboys swear they had traveled through arithmetic in the wrong direction. These are the kinds of history that nap beautifully, nothing is hurt, and ducks remain ducks. Night repairs required the patience of monks. A tooth cracked like a small heartbreak. It had to be filed and fitted, a liaison between the living gear and the idea of time itself. Old winders saved their favorite files the way violinists save bows. They cut shims from beer tins with the etiquette of surgeons. They were part engineer, part midwife, part town gossip by necessity. If the mayor lingered under the tower, looking thoughtful, the winder knew to add a little oil to the chime for weddings. If the grocer shouted, "Close enough." When the hour arrived, the winder suspected the pendulum was bragging and trimmed its ambition by a single turn of a tiny nut, hardly more than a sigh. This is an odd fact that pleases. Moving the regulation nut 1/4 turn on a long pendulum might change the rate by just under a second per day, which is the difference between a punctual bus and a story about a bus. The dials outside had their own personality. In frost, their numbers glittered with pettiness. In rain, they bowed to gutters and became philosophers. Gilding wore away in the exact shape of citizens' hopes, which is to say, unevenly but sincerely. Behind each numeral, a lamp or a sheet of white glass pretended the moon lived in the clock. At midnight, a watchman looked up to confirm the clock's version of the universe and was usually satisfied. If the hand slipped a rare indignity, it meant a friction collet had opinions, and the winder would climb with the collet tool, say a few words not in the manual, and persuade time to resume its manners. Strangely comforting, the hand is a follower, not a leader. The wheel tells it where to point. We are all hands some days. Towns differed in how they paid winders. Some offered a stipend that smelled of coins and municipal paper. Others provided housing so close to the tower that it was essentially the 7th floor with a view of pigeons. A few paid with privileges that must have felt like treats from a generous aunt. A free stall for cabbages at the spring market, 2 cords of wood from the city's trees, or the right to graze exactly 1 goat on the verge behind the rectory. One winder's contract specified beer as seems fit on the nights of public rejoicing, provided the clock does not rejoice also. Dry humor kept everything level. The winder's children learned to count by bells, to the confusion of visiting cousins who were used to clocks that kept their opinions indoors. Then came electricity like an aunt who meant well and bought the wrong hat for everyone. Motors introduced a hum to towers that had been mostly air and pigeons. Electric winders turned the crank for you, which felt elegant at first and then like a demotion. Synchronous motors allowed the national grid to conduct time as if it were a musical piece in common time. Towns lost a bit of their swing. Some winders retired, and the clocks missed their fingerprints. Others stayed on as caretakers of dignity, visiting the tower now and then to adjust the beat or listen for percussion of a misplaced thought in the strike train. Micro Hook, one elderly winder, unthreatened by modernity, installed a small radio near the mechanism so that late-night adjustments could enjoy waltzes. The clock, uninterested in Strauss, kept perfect time anyway. During wars, towers covered their dials at night, which made time anonymous, a safe civilian. Winders still climbed. Bells spoke less loudly or not at all, and the building felt like a library taken very seriously by everyone. Afterward, the coverings came down as if hats lifted from faces. Chimes resumed, cautious at first, like a voice after a long cold. People cried in bakeries at the first quarter-hour tune because it meant that flour had returned to being flour instead of strategy. The winder wrote, "Restored strike today." Children clapped. One cried briefly and then laughed. Time had never stopped. Clocks never required that drama, but the conversation with it grew louder again. Our 4th scene is about inheritance, which in clock towers is rarely money and often knowledge wrapped in rags. A retiring winder shows a successor where the floor creaks and where not to put a foot unless you want to meet the choir loft earlier than planned. He explains why the pendulum prefers Tuesdays and how to tighten the threads that hold a hammer's leather so the sound is round but not smug. He points out a nail that is more a personality test than a fastener. They drink tea poured from a thermos into cups that threaten to tip, because nothing is level up there by design or habit. At some moment, the older hand passes the key, and the younger one discovers it is heavier than it looks. Strange geology, time-made metal dents. Modern caretakers live with LEDs and caretaker apps, but the rhythm remains antique and useful. They contend with pigeons that understand modern policy and ignore it. They replace bushings with brass that shines like the inside of optimism. They document with photos what their predecessors described as cheerfully stubborn. A community still relies on the clock, though phones pretend not to. Ask a market seller when to pack up, and she'll half glance at the tower and say, "After the hour," unless the second bell says we earned more. In fog, the bell's echo becomes practical poetry. It tells fishermen whether the river is generous or sulking. A museum might own the oldest clock in the district, but the one people believe is the one that interrupts birds. There are small rituals that continue because they take almost no effort and yet bend the day toward friendliness. On New Year's Eve, the winder arrives with a scarf the color of resolutions and checks the strike. At midnight, the bell informs everyone of the simplest fact in the world, that the present is right now and then, because it has nothing else to do, keeps observing right now for the rest of the year. On the first warm day of spring, the winder slides open a mover and lets air roll through the gears like polite laughter. In August, someone always says the clock runs slow because afternoons are longer. The winder doesn't argue with folklore that is trying to be kind. He only adjusts the rate by a hair and writes, seasonal optimism corrected by one half turn. If you lean against a tower wall at dusk, you can feel the pendulum's insistence travel through stone, a heartbeat borrowed from gravity. It is not dramatic. It is a handshake that never ends. The town's errands arrange themselves around it the way chairs arrange themselves around a table. Buses try to be less late in its shadow. Dogs pause their terrier careers at the hour. They do not know why, but their owners do, and it's enough. When tourists ask if the clock is accurate, locals say, accurate for us, which is either modesty or wisdom. Children still learn to count by bells when they are lost in play. Lovers synchronize goodbyes with quarters because goodbyes deserve a steady friend. Bakers watch the second hand and pretend bread obeys it, though bread has its own calendar and often wins. Here's a closing microfact, very small and sleepy. Some towers place a coin under the foot of the regulator to make the clock run a breath faster. A coin is precisely thick enough to nudge a town toward its trains. The choice of coin is a superstition expressed as metallurgy. A copper penny works. A silver one is showing off. One winder used a washer found on Tuesday because Tuesday had been lucky in his family. The clock respected the story and behaved for 38 years. If you are still awake, imagine that coin under the pendulum's foot, up in the cool shade among beams older than 3 kinds of politics, quietly persuading time to cooperate. And if you are no longer awake, that's all right. The key hangs on its hook. The weights rest at the beginning of their small journey down. The bell waits to announce something so ordinary it becomes holy. The next minute, the pigeons have opinions I won't record. The town has set its watches by a mechanism that is content with friendship. I will keep talking softly about teeth and trains, about oil that smells like the inside of promises, and about a little book in a sticky drawer, where someone perhaps tonight will write a line in pencil. Wound at dusk, all well. Cat observed again, neutral. You might not think a city's mood could be measured by the weight of a brass ticket punch. But some mornings, a conductor's hand knew more about rush hour than any mayor ever would. The punch sat on the kitchen table beside bread and a timetable that believed in optimism. Outside, the first tram muttered to itself like an early riser finding its shoes. If you're still awake by the time I get to the tiny paper moons left by a hole punch, you're welcome to subscribe or not. The tram will keep ringing its bell either way, and the seats will remain politely wooden. We are just riding along as slowly as the tracks allow, stopping often, looking out the window, and occasionally nodding at a dog who understands public transport better than most of us. Conductor's day began earlier than clocks wanted to admit. There was the satchel waxed from years of weather and crumbs that opened with a decisive sigh. Inside sat an accountant's dream dressed for a picnic, a nest of ticket rolls and colors that looked like sherbet, a leather coin changer with 4 silver tubes that clicked like quiet typewriters, a pencil, always co-conspiratorial, and the punch itself, heavy, springy, and a little vainglorious. Some punches stamped notches shaped like tiny stars or squares. Others left delicate initials that could, in a pinch, be read as poetry. A conductor hefted the punch the way a baker weighs dough, not by measuring, but by memory. The trousers found their badge, the cap found its brim, and the timetable found the inside pocket where it would live a double life as a coaster for tea and late afternoon. A microfact that prefers to whisper on old lines. New tickets smelled faintly of glue and imagination. The depot yard woke like a friendly machine. Trams stood in rows, a herd of polite elephants in iron shoes. A man with a broom drew lines on the concrete that no passenger would ever notice, but which gave the morning a sense of rehearsal. Conductors stepped aboard, counted their float coins stacked with the seriousness of small fortresses signed, a sheet that pretended to be more official than a sheet could be, and tested the bell cord with a tug. 1 ding meant we go, 2 meant we stop, 3 meant someone important is waving. The driver and conductor exchanged a look that lasted the day. We will be sensible. And if the weather disagrees, we will be sensible in rain. Outside, milkmen took notes from the timetable without acknowledging it. Inside, seat slats practiced being slightly forgiving. Fair stages carved the city into portions the way a cook cuts an apple. Between this corner and that bridge, you owed one zone. Beyond the canal, too. As far as the cemetery, a respectful 3. Ticket rolls carried tiny maps for those who liked to argue, and they did argue, softly, as a civic sport. The conductor's finger traced the stages in the air as if blessing a loaf. Punch, tear, pass. Punch, tear, pass. An economy practice with the efficiency of knitting. Children watch the punch like a magician click. A hole appears. Click. The world feels validated, and sometimes went home with the day's confetti of Chad circles, stuck to their sleeves like carnival in miniature. A micro hook for your pocket. One Budapest conductor kept a jar of those little paper moons, stating he would plant them like seeds and grow a tree of journeys. He did not, but the jar looked hopeful on a shelf. Transfers were the delicate pastry of the system. A transfer slip allowed a passenger to continue with honor if fate required, fate being schedules that nodded to each other from opposite sides of an intersection. The slip had times printed faintly in rows. The conductor punched the current quarter hour with the self-assurance of a notary who preferred tram lines to laws. Too early on the next car, and the transfer softened to illegitimacy. Too late, and it hardened into nostalgia. Conductors learned to punch with kindness, a fraction to the generous side when rain made umbrellas behave like ideologies. They also learned the precise tone of, "Keep this handy," a phrase that means, in public transport, may destiny not cancel our appointment. The route itself assembled from ordinary landmarks that looked grander in the timetable than they did through the glass. Car barn to war memorial via fish market, brewery, technical school, and cemetery. An odd comfort lives in that sequence: work, education, lager, and the end of everything, with a bouquet of haddock in the middle. The conductor became a slow poet of corners. He knew which stop hosted late roses, which corner baked its bricks at noon, and which dog pretended to be surprised by the bell every morning at 8. He also knew which seat creaked at the exact syllable in "Tickets, Please," a duet between wood and routine. If a tram stalled, the conductor moved like a calm librarian. Bell off, brakes set, a hand lifted to the street as if to say, "We are simply pausing the world. It will resume shortly," like a bookmark. Inspectors appeared the way punctuation appears in a long sentence, not often, but meaningfully. They wore hats that originated, it seemed, at the same factory that made authority. Inspectors checked the punch by holding a ticket to the light and admiring the shape of compliance. They requested waybills, those rolled-up diaries that listed stops, times, and brief confidences. Delay at the bridge. Goose negotiations. A good inspector heard the rhythm of a line and left it undisturbed, like a gardener who knows which weeds are really neighbors. Conductors feared only being short of change, a shame equal to overcooking tea. The coin changer answered with clicks both musical and mercantile. 2 of this tube, 1 of that. Exact fare dispensed with the flair of a magician who has retired to a life of modest. Miracles, asterisk signals organized the tram's morality. A tug on the bell cord was a prayer the driver answered with motion. 1 tug to begin, 2 to stop, 3 for emergencies, though emergencies usually resolved into dropped umbrellas pretending to be tragedies. On some lines, the conductor stood on an open platform, scarf insisting upon its independence, shoes telling stories about winter. He learned to balance like a baker traveling with 3 cakes and a secret. He learned to see a late runner in the reflection of shop windows before anyone else did. He learned, without boasting, How to turn a human queue into the exact number of seats and standing places, -2, and then to apologize to those two as if public transport had personally forgotten their birthday. Evening soft as city's edges. The tickets faded to a darker tone, as tired paper does, and the bell acquired a warmth it had not had at dawn. The conductor's notebook grew chattier, lost hat found. Hat displeased. The last runs of the night had a ritual tenderness. Workers with quiet faces, lovers with loud eyes, a violinist with a case that never opened but always implied a future all, collected themselves aboard. The conductor punched like a priest of silence, one hole making another minute official. The depot lamp at the end of the line looked down as if counting heads. The satchel, lighter now, kept the day's arithmetic. Rolls thinner, coins fewer, pencil smaller, punch content. A small absurdity for your pillow. On one route, a conductor named every ticket roll as if it were a ship. Today we sailed on page number 3. She weathered a drizzle and 2 schoolboys. Some cities paid conductors partly by trust and partly by ledger. Every shift ended with coin reconciliation, a ceremony of stacking and confessing. 2 sixpences short recovered from pocket of coat at home. Both apologized. Waybills went into drawers that smelled of pencil shavings and policy. Spare punches slept in felt-lined nests like old soldiers relieved of parade duty. There were discussions about uniforms that wandered into philosophy, whether buttons should be brass, honest, or nickel, modern. Whether caps should overhang eyes, dignified or not, approachable. Whether gloves made one look like an ambassador of fairs. The answer, as always, was local and firm, and nobody far away noticed, which made it better. Ticket types multiplied and then simplified with the confidence of weeds. There were workmen's fairs at pale hours, soldiers' fairs at any, scholars' fairs on nervous mornings, weekend tickets that promised leisure and produced gardens, and the famous clipper tickets with 5 little squares that begged to be used responsibly. Oblivion waited for unscratched boxes, but so did savings. All economics is a romance between numbers and hope. The conductor punched careful patterns that revealed more than passenger and inspector realized. A diagonal meant a transfer with rain. A double punch near the corner meant someone had boarded with 3 parcels and a dignity that required acknowledgement. Secrets lived in these paper constellations, like breadcrumbs for bureaucrats who never arrived. Approach any stop and you could smell the city's intentions. The fish market gave security a hint of salt. The technical school smelled of chalk dust planning to be electricity. The cemetery lay under trees that provided shade for both the living and the scheduled. The brewery, generous with scents, made everyone friendlier for 2 stops in each direction. People boarded with their days like coats, heavy, light, dark, or slightly showy. The conductor learned to read the weather in hats and the economy in shoes. He also learned the art of pretending not to notice tears, jokes, and the quiet negotiation of a seat between 2 strangers who would never meet again and yet agreed. Briefly, on the placement of elbows. Once in a while, the tram met a parade, which made the timetable look shy. The conductor became a diplomat, negotiating passage with a drum. Tickets paused. Coins waited like gentlemen. The bell lost its authority and discovered it was a percussion instrument out of its league. Children leaned out to point, then were called back with the same sentence in 7 parental dialects. Inside, please. Inside. Afterward, progress resumed with a dignity that felt taller, and the conductor wrote in the waybill, delay, popular happiness, and nobody minded. There were mishaps suitable for bedtime. A passenger attempted to buy a fare with buttons. The conductor declined, but politely, and the passenger later returned with coins and pride. A goat boarded in rural years, stood politely, paid no fare, disembarked at the abattoir, and was later reported to have reconsidered its options entirely. A violinist played 3 notes at a stop to test the evening. The conductor punched time for him anyway. An inspector lost his hat to the wind and caught it with his dignity, which is an acrobatic feat not seen every day. None of these changed the cost of a single zone, which remained as certain as bread. Modernity arrived like a helpful cousin who speaks quickly. Conductors met it with raised eyebrows. Automatic doors learned human hesitation 1 passenger at a time. Self-service boxes suggested that punching one's own ticket was an act of maturity, comparable to paying taxes or watering plants. Some systems removed conductors and felt the tram grow a little lonelier, like a kitchen without a kettle. Others kept them as guardians of calm, and the city thanked them by not noticing, the highest civic compliment. Electronic validators beeped in the exact rhythm of old punches if you listened with kindness. Inspectors became readers of beat poetry. The coin changer retired to a museum case where children pressed noses to glass and asked whether money ever made music in the past. It did. It still does, just differently, and perhaps more quietly. Public transport collected a city's lost property the way beaches collect shells. The conductor's office of lost things cataloged umbrellas by personality, gloves by optimism, so many single gloves believed in reunions, and notebooks by eloquence. A conductor could identify a passenger by the smell of a scarf left behind, cigarette, soap, or winter. Tickets, once spent, lived in modest afterlives. Some lined drawers, others fed stoves. A few became bookmarks in novels that disembarked at Chapter 7 and wandered off to form their own unions. Confetti the little moons of the hole punch hid in cuffs and on tram floors until midnight sweepers sent them on to a second city, beneath the first. The city of dust and decisions already made. Language followed the trams around like a newspaper boy. In different towns, the conductor was a guard, a gripman's partner, a clippy, a corporador, a conductor, the one with the bell, the person who remembered your mother's stop, even if you forgot. Fare evasion had 100 quiet names, most of them tired of themselves. Honest mistakes went by their first names and were forgiven. Regulars had nicknames whispered between crew, 20-minute Charles, for a man who always boarded precisely 20 minutes late for something. Blue Scarf, who knit in winter and fell asleep in spring. The Oranges, an entire family that smelled wonderfully of citrus during January when the city needed proof that sun still existed somewhere. At the end of a shift, the conductor returned the punch, which always looked smaller on the table than it had on the route. The satchel exhaled. The timetable went back into the pocket that belonged to tomorrow. A cup of tea absorbed the day's arithmetic. Feet announced themselves as citizens with rights. Some conductors lived near the line and could hear the late cars gliding past. Some did not, but heard them anyway in the furniture. If you asked what they most remembered, they might say the weight of coins at dawn, the way snow sits in rails like polite visitors, the smell of rain on paint, or the particular kindness of a seat given up without audience. They might also remember the feeling of the punch returning the city to order. One hole at a time, and if you are drifting now, imagine the tram at night in the depot, lights out, windows reflecting nothing but possibility. Upstairs, in some small apartment, a conductor hangs the cap on a peg and puts the coin changer in a drawer that knows how to be quiet. Downstairs, the punch sleeps in its felt nest like a small iron animal with dignified dreams. The timetable lies open on the kitchen table where crumbs have taught it geography. The city will wake again to fair stages that divide morning into manageable slices, to transfers that trust the next car will arrive, and to bells that coordinate strangers without introductions. I'll keep talking softly about paper moons and coin tubes, about inspectors who smell of rain, about stops named after breweries and schools, about the way a conductor can make 2 tugs on a cord feel like reassurance. The tram will glide forward, the punch will click again, and your sleep can take the corner without even looking up. You might not expect a metal box with drawers to have a biography, but filing cabinets are surprisingly autobiographical. They sit quietly, pretending to be furniture, while holding more intimate details than most memoirs, birth records, sandwich, menus, receipts for ladders, and at least one photograph of a department picnic where everyone looks like a paperclip. If you're still awake by the time we reach the discussion of 4-pin tumbler locks and their opinions on coffee stains, you can subscribe or not. The drawers are patient and do not require applause. We will open them gently, one smooth inch at a time, the way a librarian turns pages after midnight. The story begins with paper learning to multiply. Offices discovered that writing things down prevented expensive misunderstandings, such as paying a bill twice or never, both of which are dramatic in their own quiet ways. At first, papers lounged in pigeonholes and on desks that looked like postal stations for ideas. Then flat files appeared, large shallow drawers where items rested like pastries. Beautiful and practical and perfect for maps that dislike being folded, flat files were the chaise longues of the document world. That paper kept producing younger. Siblings, memos, ledgers, patient cards, shipping slips, and the chaise longue became a dormitory. What the office needed was vertical gravity, the courage to stack ambition on ambition and call it efficient. Thus, the vertical filing cabinet arrived with a kind of moderate fanfare, the sound a rubber stamp makes when it discovers destiny. The early cabinets were wooden, handsome, and susceptible to stories. They smelled like pencil sharpenings and the cautious optimism of new departments. Each drawer, capable of lifting a modest bicep, housed folders that behaved like citizens of a well-run city street. Labels stood up to be read in a uniform font that should have been called reasonable serif. Within those folders, paper formed orderly neighborhoods, correspondence to the left, invoices to the right, occasional cry for help in the middle margin. Clerks whose hands learned the topography of edges developed a glide unique to their profession, a reach, a flex, the little finger testing the weight of an answer, a microfact that pretends to be a yawn, more than one office instituted, a rule about humming while filing. It was permitted, provided the key did not clash with the bell of the front door. By the time steel took over, everything had the confidence of drawers on rails. A steel cabinet could endure the contents of a small revolution and only require a wipe with a cloth afterward. Rails learned to whisper. Handles learned to look. Professional. The satisfying click of fully closed became a promise you could build a day around. Manufacturers debated the theology of drawer depth. Should a drawer accept legal size with a shrug, or embrace it like a tall relative? 4-drawer models appealed to optimists. 5-drawer models appealed to institutions that preferred to be thorough in all directions. There were cabinets with honest feet and cabinets that pretended to levitate on plinths, which is a dramatic word for a very calm rectangle. Folders evolved like polite animals. Manila, born the color of tea with milk, wore tab tats marked JANAPR May August, or in the adventurous offices, open issues, closed issues, and issues that made eye contact. Hanging folders learned to suspend themselves from rails like gymnasts who had discovered bureaucracy. Inside them, thin paper fasteners performed metal origami, tucking reports together with the composure of a conservatory musician. The binder clip arrived looking like a beetle and, reputation aside, kept more marriages of paper together than romance ever did. Hole punches practiced small astronomy, 2-hole, 3-hole, 4-hole constellations charting a sky of memos. A desk drawer without a hole punch felt like a kitchen without a spoon. The index, the cabinet's conscience, grew in cards and cabling. Little drawers of alphabet marched beside larger drawers of tax years, and the office discovered the comfort of talking to itself. A person sent forth to find the red invoice from last November with the unusually honest arithmetic returned. With it, as if retrieving a cat that always came when called. The trick was always the same: a spine label in a font that took its vitamins, a folder tab at precisely 1/3 intervals, and a card in the front that said, in effect, "This is where it is." Even if you momentarily forget where you are. Some offices use color to discipline chaos. Blue for finance, green for personnel, yellow for don't lose this again, and pink for matters that require gentleness. In one archive, grant proposals shimmered in lavender, which made modest budgets look faintly luxurious. Keys entered, jangling lightly, and entire floors of buildings felt safer. A 4-pin lock with a brass escutcheon turned so modestly that it could have been signing a treaty. Key control logs appeared like guestbooks for access. Who opened what? Which drawer fell in love with which key when the key returned from lunch? Attached by a humble chain or a ribbon, the key developed a sense of belonging. One micro-absurdity. A municipal office in the 1930s kept its cabinet key in a sealed envelope, which was naturally stored inside the locked cabinet. Opening hours were a philosophical concept until someone brought a screwdriver and the agreement that this was not ideal. *** filing teaches a language of prepositions: in, under, between, behind, next to, after, before. Clerks became fluent and then bilingual in cross-reference, writing little notes that lived to be appreciated. See also taxes, overpayment by swans. The structure grew rhythmic. A new document arrived, perhaps a receipt for boots. It was stamped in the corner with a date that decided its temperament. It received a number, not so much a name as a handshake. It earned a paperclip then, a folder, then a place in a drawer that accepted it with a practical welcome. Later, summoned by a pencil notation on a form, it emerged into daylight exactly where expected. The universe rarely offers such kindness. Filing cabinets did, whenever someone treated them like puzzle boxes that prefer to be solved politely. Archives scaled this comfort into cathedrals. Rows of cabinets made aisles so straight that the air itself felt measured. The trolley of filing cabinets' slow cousin rolled in with a pile of intentions on its back. Inside the drawers, climate control performed quiet heroics, keeping paper at the humidity of a reasonable day. Gloves appeared, not for pomp, but to keep the oils of living from shaking hands with the past. Each folder became a time pocket where someone's yesterdays stayed unwrinkled. Researchers arrived like pilgrims and left like librarians. The cabinets, untroubled by fame, watched scholars take notes about grocery lists and maritime disasters with the same concentration. If you open a drawer of ship manifests at dawn, the cabinet seems to smell faintly of rope, but that is only the power of suggestion. And perhaps the janitor's new mop, bureaucracy. That long novel, written by many authors with identical pens, lived happily in these drawers. A permit application began its pilgrimage in the top left. Visited the third drawer for comments, the bottom drawer for approvals. Returned to the top for a friendly stamp, and settled finally behind a tab that said, "Issued." The cabinet did not judge. It observed. While politics became seasons, the cabinet remained weather. Some offices gave their cabinets names: Mildred, Hector, Perseverance, as if to apologize for asking so much of them. The drawers glided out, ratcheting their blessed Morse code of order. K-k-k-k-k, thrum. At closing time, a clerk, discovering a misfiled envelope, would perform the sacred act of correction and sleep that night with a purity of conscience uncommon outside. Monasteries dot, and then computers arrived with their smooth pockets of invisible space. Carefully, sometimes reluctantly, the cabinet became both less necessary and more symbolic. Old drawers now house power cords and fierce opinions about floppy disks. Offices promised a paperless future and promptly printed the promise. 3 copies, filed under future. Yet even digital systems learned manners from cabinets. File trees borrowed the language of drawers, folders, and tabs. Search bars did what index cards had done, only faster, without the pen smudge on a thumb. The save icon, shaped as a floppy disk, represents an object most of us barely remember. The mental image of a folder remains vanilla. When a server room hums at night, it has the spiritual continuity of a row of steel cabinets guarding the secrets of a quiet industry dot in the age of scanning. Cabinets entered their museum period, which is to say they kept working while people complemented their vintage charm. Archivists formed strategies, accession, appraisal, description, boxing, metadata, the kind of words that fall asleep upright. Cabinets learned to cohabitate with acid-free cartons that resembled obedient shoeboxes. Keys, now retired, still rattled in drawers where paperclips conducted community outreach. Some cabinets discovered new careers as side tables. Others painted cheerful colors, joined artist studios where they stored brushes and the occasional argument about primer. In one delightful case, a 4-drawer veteran became a planter for herbs. Each drawer half open with thyme, basil, mint, and rosemary, establishing a cuisine of cross-reference. Hidden inside every cabinet is a tragedy, narrowly avoided, the misfile that might have destabilized a Tuesday. Entire offices developed rituals to appease the gods of order. Left hand to pull, right hand to recheck. Speak the label aloud before inserting. Breathe. An astonishing number of people perfected the microfold. A 0.5 mm buckle at the corner of a document that caused it to behave. A few installed spring-back followers, those movable metal backs that press the file upright, which function like good posture in gym class. Others used out cards, prepaid apologies for borrowing, removed by Anton. 10:03 will return after coffee. Probably. These customs transformed the archive into a polite neighborhood where nothing truly disappeared. It merely stepped out and left forwarding information. The life of a cabinet was punctuated by inventories, which are the office equivalent of counting sheep while the sheep help. Once a year, 2 clerks armed with lists and inevitable pencils, never pens, walk down aisles reading out loud to no one in particular. Accounts, awards, bids, the bicycles, confiscated. The second clerk tallied with the solemnity of a choir member. When an item was missing, the entire aisle sighed and waited for the joke. Have you tried looking under for misplaced? Eventually, the document turned up in a perfectly logical place that had temporarily forgotten its logic. Like a cat on top of a wardrobe, pretending not to understand ladders. Heat and dust. Those patient enemies of paper received campaigns of resistance. Cabinets were arranged away from radiators as if negotiating with winter. Blotters lay like little deserts to absorb unexpected weather. The office plant, a ficus known for its concern, learned to droop if humidity misbehaved. In basements, where pipes thought about drama, cabinets stood on blocks to demonstrate they had read the flood plan. A good cabinet makes you think of seaworthiness. Many have quietly survived leaks that would have turned other furniture into tea. When they rested, someone brought emery cloth and a conversation about paint. And the cabinet felt cared for, which is an anthropomorphism it has earned. Asterisk. There is a sound that only late filing makes. The lonely swish of a drawer at 6:12 p.m. when the hallway lights have decided it is evening. In that sound is the memory of 1,000 resolved doubts. There's also a smell, paper, graphite, adhesive, and the answer to a question you had yesterday. Somewhere, a clerk wraps a rubber band around a folder that contains a whole year of electricity bills and rights. 2004 on a label that will outlive 3 managers and 4 staplers. This is how institutions remember themselves. Not with speeches, but with the minor courage of alphabetical order. In some cities, cabinets were witnesses to little revolutions. A new form replaced an old form with the same numbers and a different title. The old form, not yet ready for retirement, stayed 1 more year, tucked behind a divider labeled Legacy, which is office language for we're gentle. During strikes or storms, cabinets kept their posture. After weddings, births, and retirements, cabinets absorbed the evidence certificates, memos, announcements, and agreed to be the family attic for public life. One drawer housed evidence of a new traffic light, surveys, signatures, a photo of a coroner that no longer remembers itself. Another preserved complaints about pigeons, arranged by decade, proof that the birds have tenure dot to handle photographs. Cabinets welcome sleeves made of polypropylene, a word that sounds like a staircase. Prints slid into them with a sigh as pleasing as a nap. Negatives, shy things that dislike fingerprints, live like nocturnal animals in envelopes. Holes from previous staples told archaeological stories. You could tell which supervisor preferred the left corner. Engineers filed blueprints in tall cabinets that opened like corridors. The drawings, unrolled, looked like cities dreaming of themselves. Musicians filed scores with pencil edits, quiet arguments solved by rest. Doctors stored charts with tabs color-coded in sequences that only nurses truly understood. Every profession taught the cabinet a dialect, and the cabinet responded by listening. There were disasters too, politely handled. A drawer tipped if extended beyond its center of gravity, and a clerk learned why the term anti-tilt mechanism deserved applause. Fireproof cabinets, heavy as modest automobiles, arrived with gaskets and seriousness. In one anecdote, a fireproof cabinet fell through a floor during a blaze and was retrieved the next day, smoky but intact, like a loaf that survived an adventurous oven. Inside, the paper smelled faintly of having a story. Insurance adjusters patted the cabinet the way one pats a horse after a long ride. Everyone promised to buy another, and there were jokes. A cabinet labeled miscellaneous multiplied into miscellaneous A and miscellaneous B, which is how chaos wears a tuxedo. A drawer labeled keys held a surprising number of keys that had long since lost the desire to unlock anything. One office kept a folder titled Compliments, containing 3 notes from 1978, a postcard with a sunset, and a photocopy of a doodle that looked faintly like victory. Another kept a folder of unclear requests, containing wonderful phrases, kindly expedite the process you know about, and send that thing again. This time faster, each filed under hope. Even now, in an era of cloud drives that weigh exactly nothing and backups that live in places we have never seen, there is solace in the tangible act of sliding a drawer. You can hear a decision. You can touch a policy. You can take responsibility with both hands. A folder has heft thin when young, stout when experienced, unwieldy when famous. Many of us sleep better knowing that somewhere, behind a label printed in small uppercase, a folder contains the receipts that make a year make sense. The city's memory has a hinge. If you are drowsy, imagine this. A long hallway where the carpet knows what whisper means. Along the walls sit cabinets of varying decades oak with brass cups, gray steel with chrome smiles, beige with more optimism than taste. A clock ticks with the restraint of a metronome teaching patience to time. Somewhere a pencil rolls 3 inches and stops as if reconsidering travel. You open a drawer. It slides with the steady courtesy of a door opened by someone who likes you. Inside, the quiet alphabet, waiting. Your hands do the old choreography thumb along the tops, eyes scanning tabs, mind idling happily in clerical neutral. You think, not unproudly, I know where things are. The drawer closes with its small, dignified kiss. The hallway fades into the kind of silence that keeps, and somewhere deep in the cabinet, the folders rest, slightly warmed by the belief that order is a form of kindness, which is the softest thought to fall asleep to. You might not expect a plank of wood with 4 metal legs to have a civic biography, but public benches have surprisingly long resins. They sit in the open with the patience of a librarian on a lunch break, taking notes on the weather and the passing shoes. If you're still awake by the time we reach the part about municipal varnish schedules and the correct angle for a restful backslat, you can subscribe or not. Benches are famously non-judgmental. For now, imagine the smallest announcement of comfort ever made by a city, a rectangle. Shoulder height to a sparrow, just far enough from the path to be an option and not an obstacle. The first benches were not called benches. They were stones on which markets balanced, monastery plinths that accidentally learned hospitality, and lengths of timber pressed into service while someone discussed grain. Medieval towns adopted the settle and the long stool, portable in theory and immovable in practice, wide enough for a baker, a basket, and second thoughts. In church porches, they became a theological waiting room, where a person could consider eternity and the quality of the roof at the same time. Guild halls placed long forms along walls so that guild members could look public-spirited while resting their feet. There is a pleasant, useless fact. In some towns, the local magistrate's bench and the town bench were the same object on different days, meaning you could receive a verdict and a sandwich in the same place. With only a change in expression required dot with boulevards, came the idea that resting could be an urban design, not an accident. Paris in the 19th century invented a bench with the confidence of a city that had recently discovered symmetry. Slats ran horizontally like measured laughter. The cast iron legs curled into polite grammar. Sitters faced the promenade or the garden, as if the scenery had paid for the good seats. London developed park seats with names Lister, Parkland, the Serpentine type sturdy, green, and deeply convinced of their own modesty. Some had commemorative plaques before the plaques commemorated anyone, which is advanced optimism. In Vienna, the Stadtpark learned a curve that seemed to hold you as a parent holds a drowsy idea. In each place, the bench carried the municipal opinion of what a pause should look like. Formal, friendly, or a little bit like furniture that has gone outside to think. Benches organize time into acceptable fragments. A bench says, 10 minutes are appropriate here, and pedestrians agree, relieved to be instructed. Gardeners made schedules that looked like soft arithmetic 15 benches per hectare in lawns. Fewer beneath beech trees because the leaves negotiated shade on their own. Engineers measured the distance between armrests with a calm normally reserved for bridges. Some benches had central arms to prevent lying down. Others had generous spans that invited an entire chapter of a novel and a nap that pretended to be meditation. There were philosophical debates about backs versus backless. Backless benches suggest a brief, upright pause, like standing in line without the line. Benches with backs encourage the city to pour itself into your shoulders and apologize for the noise. Neither side won. Both multiplied graciously. Materials keep diaries of weather. Stone benches record centuries as a series of coldologies, slowly polished by coats and discussions about potatoes. Wood benches know seasons. Their grain is a calendar of rain, the way a vinyl record is a calendar of songs. Cast iron holds the memory of its molten youth and always looks slightly overdressed. Concrete, the pragmatist, arrived in the 20th century with the charisma, permanence, and the willingness to be host. After the war years, when cities learned to rebuild with speed, concrete benches appeared like thoughtful punctuation, wide and low, good for groups and arguments that needed a horizon. In Scandinavian plazas, benches made of warm-toned larch declared that even winter deserved a place to sit. And they were right, provided your coat agreed. There are also the rare experiments. Glass benches that felt untrustworthy, rubber benches that felt like jokes, and aluminum benches that warmed to the exact temperature of a friendly key dot. The placement of a bench is a cartography of kindness. Near a bridge, a bench faces water because water thinks slowly and rewards witnesses. Near a playground, a bench faces noise because noise is a photograph of childhood. Along an avenue, benches are placed just before and after decisions crosswalks. Fountains, kiosks so that people can pause and consult themselves. Bus stops are furnished with seats that convert waiting into being somewhere, a small miracle. Railway platforms offer benches at exact intervals, dictated by someone who once measured stride length during a meeting. In old towns, benches live near statues because statues enjoy company even if they pretend otherwise. The mild absurdity is that statues never sit. They are forever standing while the living arrange their ankles and judge the pigeons. The etiquette of benches evolved without minutes or votes. A person joins one end and leaves a respectful parcel of air, the civic equivalent of a handshake. Strangers share weather reports and opinions of dogs. If there is a plaque, it is read with the reverence given to a postcard from a careful friend. Sometimes the plaque says, "in memory of," and sometimes "in celebration of," and both are accurate. A sitting is both a tiny memorial to the rushing we did earlier and a celebration of the fact that we briefly stopped. Micro hooks accumulate. This was the first bench where someone finished knitting a sweater that looked suspiciously like a bench. That was the bench where a pocket map unfolded to the size of a tablecloth and then folded back with the content a map displays when it knows more than you do. Asterisk. Cities tried folding time into benches by way of devices. In seaside towns, windbreak benches grew glass backs that watched storms like television. Alpine benches learned to be carved trunk halves, capable of hosting a family and several ambitions. Tram shelters experimented with leaning rails, halfway benches for people who favored compromise. In the 1960s, experiments in modular seating produced benches that could be rearranged with hexagonal optimism, the honeycomb of civic rest. In the digital century, benches developed USB ports and solar shades, which is delightful and makes the older benches smile indulgently. They have seen fads pass like clouds, while they remained simply at the right height for knees. The bench is also the city's school for small ceremonies. Wedding photos recruited as a witness. Tourists appointed the minister of sandwiches. Older residents train the bench in the art of chess, leaning in so that the pieces can listen. Runners adore the bench as a stretching partner with good posture. The bench knows how to wait for owls with a thermos that smells like modest tea. It knows when a conversation is better conducted in parallel, looking at trees, with the old trick of clarity that comes from not making eye contact. It also knows how to hold silence the way a bookstore holds air. In parks, benches become classrooms for botany conducted by grandparents, who identify 3 species confidently and make up affectionate names for the rest. Urban planners discovered, slowly and then all at once, that benches create other things accidentally. Place 3 benches in a shallow U, and you have a neighborhood council that meets every afternoon between 4 and 6. Put 1 bench under a lamp, and a tiny piazza appears around it, a place where a dog sniffs democracy and decides it is adequate. Line benches along a promenade, and you invent the art of watching without participating, a sport extremely popular with hats. Remove benches, and a street becomes somewhere to hurry through. Add them, and the same street becomes a room with a view and a policy. In this way, benches are furniture for public living rooms, curated with the humility of items that know their own verbs. Sit, type, breathe, wait, read. Think dot, there is science in the comfort. 18 inches deep for the seat, give or take the philosophy of the architect. A slope of 2 to 8 degrees, depending on whether the bench should say, stay a while, or stretch your calves and be on your way. Back height to the shoulder blades if kindness is the theme. Lower if the view should do the supporting. Slat spacing enough to allow rain to fall through and crumbs to begin new lives. Armrests rounded to prevent the polymerization of sleeves. This is engineering as lullaby, precise so that the user may be imprecise. When you feel a good bench, you feel the mathematics of angles translated into the grammar of comfort. The city, which is usually busy explaining itself loudly with traffic, whispers here in degrees and millimeters. Benches sometimes become librarians for unplanned collections. A bench near a school gathers the daily journal of lost buttons. A bench by a river collects fishing stories reluctantly released into the air, which is why ducks are so well informed. In winter, benches keep small archives of snow that tell you where the wind changed its mind around midnight. In autumn, they file leaves by a system the trees pretend not to understand. On windy days, a bench becomes an advisor to wayward hats. On market mornings, it becomes a tasting room for strawberries, with the tiniest of courts convened to decide whether the seller was right about sweetness. Most verdicts are positive and sticky. There are also the maintenance rituals, which are the slow choreography of municipal affection. Paint crews arrive with the quiet confidence of people who believe in second coats. A color chart appears, ranging from park green to park green but slightly more sincere. Brushes move, bolts tighten, moss is gently negotiated with. Worn slats are replaced and become shelves and clever sheds, or parts of community projects that insist wood should live twice. In some cities, volunteers adopt benches and write to them in newsletters. Dear bench, we remove the chewing gum and help you feel lighter. The bench, unmoved by fame, continues to do what it does best, be precisely where someone decides to acknowledge that walking is an activity with an off switch. Of course, there are controversies so mild they might be yawns. Should benches accommodate napping? Should they be heated in winter like kindly stones? Should there be more near libraries and fewer near fountains that gossip loudly? Accessibility advocates remind us correctly that an unbroken stretch of bench without armrests can be a wall to those who need help standing, while too many armrests can turn rest into a puzzle. Designers talk to communities and produce the quiet miracle of compromise, a bench with a rhythm of supports that allows both rising and reclining, a seat height that answers needs rather than fashion. Every so often a bench is designed by an artist and looks like a question mark. The public debates whether to sit on it, then sits, which answers the question dot in memorial culture. Benches have become letters written to those who can no longer check the mail. Plaques tell micro-stories, a teacher who loved ducks, a gardener who always carried seeds, a couple who ate apricots here every Sunday summer remembered to provide. The syntax is usually simple name, dates, a line that looks like a smile, and that simplicity does the work. Some cities allow QR codes that link to longer stories, but the bench prefers the haiku. It knows that the living will fill in the rest while watching a cloud perform the slowest cartwheel ever attempted. If you have ever sat on a memorial bench and felt, for 1 second, properly accompanied, you have understood the bench's essential religion, presence as gentle architecture, ... Travel writers rarely list benches as attractions. Yet we remember cities by their seating the way we remember friends by their chairs. Rome's marble steps pretend to be benches and succeed. Kyoto offers wooden platforms that teach the knee how to wait. New York's park seats are the color of endurance and gently chatter in the morning with joggers. Istanbul's seaside benches are tuned to the pitch of ferries. In small villages, benches outside front doors serve as international embassies of gossip, each with diplomatic immunity. On long trails, a single bench appears where the path confesses to being steeper than it meant to be. You sit, and someone before you has carved initials into the back. A small archaeology of rest layered like lichens, There are secret benches as well. The ones tucked behind museums where the staff escape with their sandwiches and the exhibits exhale. The bench just inside a cemetery wall, placed where names become nouns and sentences become wind, and you learn the difference between quiet and silence. The hidden bench in a university quadrangle, used by 2 generations of students to practice speeches that will later sound improvised. The bench behind a small-town post office where the entire zip code's foreign policy is negotiated, every morning between 9 and 9:30, weather permitting. Finding these benches is less a map skill than a habit of noticing where the city takes a breath. Occasionally, a bench is moved, which is the municipal equivalent of relocating a punctuation mark. People notice. The regular walker changes stride. The chess players renegotiate sunlight. A dog pauses where a bench used to be and files a silent report. The new location may offer a superior view, but it takes weeks for the old conversations to follow. When a bench disappears entirely, the absence is a hole where a minute used to live. Replacement is a ceremony without speeches. A truck arrives. The legs dap the ground, someone tightens, someone nods, and the bench is sworn in. During festivals, benches become grandstands for small spectacles processions that feature more banners than participants. Parades of bicycles that declare sovereignty. Street musicians who tune the evening until it agrees to be pleasant. During emergencies, benches become staging points. Line breaks where everyone learns the next instruction and kindness thickens. During ordinary days, which are the city's specialty, benches become proof that ordinary exists because you can sit inside it and be exactly no one special for 15 minutes. That democratic humility is the bench's quiet politics. It votes for rest across party lines. A bench is also an index to the local fauna. Pigeons hold Congress on the armrests and pass resolutions concerning crumbs. Squirrels consider benches launching platforms and practice parkour with a professionalism that deserves a stipend. Sparrows behave like baristas, managing the flow of customers with rapid, purposeful hops. In coastal towns, gulls apply for ownership of entire benches and are denied. They appeal loudly and are still denied. Dogs consider a bench part of their news network and check it for updates. Cats, if allowed outdoors, ignore benches with theatrical contempt, and then secretly nap beneath them. One could speak about the odd legal history of benches, when loitering was a crime committed by people who forgot to appear purposeful, and when cities learned that a good bench reduces trouble by converting wanderers into rests. One could also trace the economics. A bench costs less than most civic improvements and yields more immediate gratitude. Budgets like that. There are spreadsheets somewhere, pale green and tidy, calculating the price per shared minute. And yet the true accounting is uncountable. How many arguments softened, how many headaches retreated, how many friendships scheduled themselves for weekly maintenance at 3 in the afternoon on the shady side. If you need sleep, picture a bench in late evening after the park has agreed to be a room. The last runners pass like commas. A fountain edits itself into gentler phrases. The wood is warm from the day and then cools in a way your hands understand without thinking. The city continues, but at a distance, like a choir hum you can place but cannot see. You sit for as long as a page takes to turn. You stand because standing still exists. You leave the bench to its night shift, watching the constellation of streetlights consult each other, offering neighborhood foxes the dignity of an audience, gathering dew the way a patient librarian gathers returns. It will be there in the morning, the municipal promise kept. The softest piece of infrastructure, a rectangle of permission waiting to be used again. And if tomorrow someone asks what the city did for you today, you might say, it gave me a bench. They will nod, thinking you have given a small answer, but you and I will know it contained a path that learned how to pause, a designment negotiated with knees and weather, a devotion to anonymous kindness, and the service of a thing that knows when to be present and when to disappear beneath a book. The bench will not overhear. It is busy counting birds in minutes in equal measure, which is all we ever needed from history tonight, a place to sit inside it quietly until eyelids perform their thoughtful closing ceremony and the world reclines a fraction of an inch, like a well-made backslat agreeing with the spine. You might not expect a rubber stamp to decide when a person sleeps, but in the Soviet Union, a small purple square could move a bedtime by weeks. The corridor hums. A file drawer shivers like an accordion that only knows one note. A nurse with careful handwriting wears a watch that has never once hurried. If you are still awake by the time I get to the exercise sheet with the oddly specific recommendation to swing your arms 48 times before tea, feel very free to subscribe. Or don't. The payphone on the wall will not tell me either way. It is busy breathing. We begin at a door that opens not with drama, but with paperwork, and a clerk who greets you and your folder at the same time, as if you and your folder are distant cousins arriving together for a holiday you both forgot to plan. A registratsia desk lives under a low lamp with an old soul. The clerk asks your patronymic like it's a library code. The stamp presses the page with the assurance of a boot stepping into shallow snow. You receive a ticket torn to 2 neat lines, one to keep, one to travel into the bloodstream of the building. The psychonevrology dispenser is part clinic, part calendar. It assigns a doctor, a follow-up day, and a file that will accompany you more faithfully than some winter gloves. Advice is handed over as items you can fold. A rest note for your foreman, a slip for a sanatorium, a list of gentle movements pinned to your week. Care begins with the mechanical poetry of forms because the forms decide which door opens, and doors decide which advice is possible. On the wall, a poster explains psychohygiene, and it looks suspiciously like sleep, fresh air, and the pleasant tyranny of routine. The file, which is the true main character here, fattens with visit summaries like a goose before a holiday, only with more paper and fewer feathers. Propiska, that stamp which tells the city where you officially belong, plays a secondary part that feels like a primary one. The personnel office and the clinic consult each other like 2 ants trading opinions about you in a kitchen. The result may be extra days off to repair your nerves or an inconvenient suggestion to repair your schedule. A line in the file can slow a job change in the way a speed bump slows a bicycle, gently but not negotiably. Some people quietly seek help at a clinic far from home, a sort of medical tourism conducted on trams, because distance is the oldest form of privacy. Doctors learn to write with kindness and exact verbs. Improved becomes a verb that moves a little, like a radio dial that prefers 2 stations but can be persuaded to like a third. Every signature has weight. You can almost hear the ink thinking. The routine of care feels like choreography rehearsed with soft shoes. You arrive on your day because days belong to the appointment book. The doctor asks questions that sound like weather, and you answer with months. Neurasthenia is a diagnosis you can hold without breaking it. Reactive state is essentially a label that says life was unusually lifelike this year. The hallway smells like a tidy pharmacy in the coat room. You are offered small tablets or a larger idea, permission to rest. A card is written to your workplace in a tone that suggests your supervisor will understand. Supervisors, it turns out, enjoy official letters almost as much as people enjoy naps. If the tram stalls on the way home, the pause converts itself into treatment because the instructions recommend avoiding haste. Somewhere a brochure explains progressive relaxation without mentioning that all relaxation is progressive if you do it slowly enough. The friendly tyranny extends to sanatorium slips, the beige keys to weeks of structure. The paper is small. The idea is large. Whole industries have assigned air, pine, sea, steppe, Caucasus mountain, Baltic mildness. You arrive at a sanatorium and the afternoon is already designed for you like a cheerful spreadsheet. Meals are served at times that feel like well-behaved bells. Walks are prescribed, which is an enjoyable verb. You are told to stroll as if the path were part of your chart. Mineral baths know more about history than most of us. They sigh in the language of naturally occurring salts and the quiet slosh of collective health. A nurse with a pencil lists your procedures, a word that contains both mud and sun. You attend a lecture on work hygiene and discover it is half about posture, half about lighting, and entirely about the political reliability of a good chair. Back in the city, help lives in practical corners. The Dom Culture, the House of Culture, posts a notice about a telephone of trust, which sounds like a fairy tale device, but is actually a phone number that outlasts a rumor. Librarians develop a side specialty in book prescriptions, short stories for winter, nature essays for Sundays, dictionaries when language feels too big and you would like it alphabetized. Breathing circles meet in basements with generous chalk dust, where people exhale until the building sighs with them. Sports circles organize routines that are careful with the word sport. They prefer walking to sprinting and call it tourism on foot, which is both accurate and soothing. Language wraps the care in official cloth. Psychohygiene suggests that washing your thoughts is not that different from washing your hands. And both are recommended before dinner. Kitchen tables become evening clinics. The window is open a finger's width. The radiator clicks like a patient metronome, and the tea is concentrated enough to count as a second opinion. Friends talk late in a grammar of sideways sentences. Nobody announces therapy, but advice collects in teacups. Grandmothers prescribe beekeeping wisdoms they never learned, and somehow they help. In stairwells, neighbors exchange mild rumors about new breathing techniques. Some patients visit the dispenser monthly. Others stop only when the appetite returns and the world shrinks to a comfortable size. The goal written on paper is practical and measurable. Sleep at night, stand at day. Most medicine here is a calendar that prefers squares to exclamation points. The spectrum of treatment is wide, like a wardrobe of modest coats. There are tranquilizers that learn your name without fanfare, small white coins that purchase a quieter evening. There are antipsychotics with the charisma of serious furniture. They do not chatter. There are simple routines: awaken at 8, eat breakfast regardless of hunger, walk around the block even if the block is stubborn. A nurse explains that rest is an active verb and shows you how to do it. If mood declines in December, an extra lamp is recommended, even if the lamp is just an agreement to sit near a window with a good Soviet radiatorscape underneath. Diagnostic terms act like umbrellas. They are designed to be wide enough to catch what falls without arguing about the weather. And then there's the word that grew barbs. Psikushka, originally a nickname for locked psychiatric wards, it inflated into a national ghost. Reports emerged that diagnoses could be stretched like wool to cover dissent, that labels such as sluggish schizophrenia might be fitted to inconvenient citizens with the tailoring of bureaucracy. Special institutes took on reputations no building should want, becoming symbols outside their own gates. The ethics debates were rightly loud in the newspapers where they were allowed, and even louder in kitchens where they were not. Yet at the same time, ordinary care continued in ordinary clinics, in rooms with calendars and rubber plants, with doctors who quietly disagreed with excess and practiced medicine like gardening, cutting back the obvious weeds, watering the tender things, keeping records in tidy rows. Truth lands in fragments. Some dark corners were documented. Some halls were simply pale green and smelled of camphor. The country held both. The diagnosis landscape also included alcohol dependence, which was everywhere and nowhere at once like steam in winter. People called it a bottle problem, the way one might call a blizzard some weather. Here the state built a parallel world of narcology clinics whose walls carried the stern geometry of resolution. Inside, aversion cures were offered next to group meetings that counted dry days with the mathematical optimism of chalk on a slate. A doctor might administer desulfurim, a chemical pack that made vodka into a loud, immediate teacher. Advice had the tone of a foreman who wants you to succeed. Remove spare keys from the kitchen. Tell the neighbor to visit without bottles. Walk before dinner. Boil tea as if it were a project. Families developed corridor strategies. They learned to hide the spare key high on the wardrobe and to treat payday like a holiday that required organization, language, preferred metaphors. People spoke of tired nerves rather than illness, as if nerves were tied shoelaces that simply needed retying. Someone was out of sorts, meaning the alphabet had been scrambled but would line up again. Euphemism did gentle work in a place where labels could be heavy. Pride resisted the word depression, not because sadness didn't exist, but because the vocabulary tried to keep spirits upright by grammar alone. A badge from a sanatorium I rested at Kislovodsk went into a photo album like a small medal, proof that the state and the body had briefly agreed on something. Progress was measured in sleep that stuck, and walks that lengthened, and a day's work that talked back to meaning. Aftercare was written in margins. A nurse phoned quietly. A club leader asked after you in the corridor. A librarian kept aside a pleasant book about trees. Meanwhile, the paperwork continued its unhurried career. Files thickened with notes shaped like postcards to the future. Patient reports improved sleep after evening walks. Recommends reading before bed. Tea reduced. The best pages were dull. Dull meant nothing dramatic had happened. Dull meant a person had resumed the excellent habit of being themselves. When a transfer to a new job required a medical brief, the clinic wrote in a syntax that could pass a border. Factual, calm, no adjectives that weighed more than the subject. A good file is encyclopedic in tone. It knows things without opinion. Some people tried to game it, insisting they felt worse to prolong a rest note. Others minimized. The doctors developed an ear for both and aimed continually for the practical middle. Sanatoriums were, in their own way, museums of standardized hope. Breakfasts repeated across time zones. A nap after lunch was not a suggestion but an event. The entire building performed the same sentence at once. Forests became health partners with tenure. People walked under pines that had already advised several generations and expected to advise several more. The sea offered a curriculum of salt, wind, and a horizon line you could align your mood against. Mineral waters came with tasting rituals and the dignified absurdity of sipping iron-rich warmth from a tulip-shaped glass at 9 precisely. A poster taught you how to breathe through the nose. Out slowly, and you passed it daily as if the wall were reminding you to belong to air again. Asterisk. The telephone of trust had a personality that shifted by hour. In the afternoon, it was practical, recommending earlier dinners and less radio. By night, it was confessional, a voice in the dark that reminded you how morning works. Some callers simply needed to hear the phrase, "You did the right thing by calling," which is a tiny rescue boat in any language. The operators were half psychologists, half weather forecasters. They reminded people that moods, like fronts, pass. A surprising number of calls involved advice about sleeping socks. The nation invented many solutions. One of them was warm feet. The debate about misuse never vanished, and it should not. But ordinary clinics continued to insist that a person's ordinary life could be repaired by ordinary means. A factory brigade met the returning worker with a practical welcome. Someone quietly assigned a task neither too heavy nor too light. Someone else made sure the break room kept its kettle accurate. When a person was transferred to a less intense position, The brief might read like directions to a gentler neighborhood. Side effects of medications were treated with the seriousness of a creaking stair. Adjustments were made by milligrams and afternoons. There is a sort of dignity in the way small changes carry large consequences, like the way a tram needs only a few millimeters of rail to be aligned. The bottle, however, continued to be a persistent citizen. Campaigns asked people to choose compote. Posters illustrated livers with the earnestness of a textbook. Brewed kvass appeared in barrels on street corners, an amber truce. In narcology centers, group meetings developed their own folklore. A man who had counted to 1,000 dry days was celebrated with a handshake that lasted longer than most speeches. An old worker admitted he had switched to crossword puzzles and had never been busier. The group recognized the return of spring with a collective walk to a river and a ceremony of skipping stones, which is not medically necessary but is emotionally accurate. Families wrote Quiet Week on calendars like a recurring appointment with themselves. Language remained a coping tool. When a neighbor asked after your health, it was acceptable to reply, "I am keeping a regime," which sounded like politics but meant bedtime. "I have been prescribed air," a wonderful phrase, covered a walk with medical authority. The nerves were tired, we let them sit. People developed albums in which their sanatorium stamps lived beside photos of soups and sunsets. Evidence that rest, like travel, deserves documentation. You might meet someone who had memorized a poem for the express purpose of telling their own thoughts what to do. Poetry is, after all, a kind of schedule dot by the late decades. New terms arrived like new lamps. Some psychiatrists studied cognitive approaches under names that sounded very global. They adjusted their practice in ways that would not attract too much attention from committees allergic to novelty. Community groups formed in the safe grammar of clubs, where meetings discussed practicalities and never used the word meeting. Dietitians discovered the ancient secret of breakfast and repackaged it for winter. A few clinics experimented with light therapy, which is simply a polite way of asking the sun to work night shift. None of this was revolutionary at volume. It was evolutionary at a whisper. If you were to follow a patient through a year, the map would look like a braid of small threads, a stamp here, a week there, a phone call at night that did not solve a problem so much as domesticate it, a return to work negotiated in 3 visits, a relapse with the bottle encountered with both discipline and tea, a librarian's smile that remembered your name and preferred genre, a doctor who reminded you to wear a hat because hats are competent devices, a nurse who pointed at the evening and said, "Walk that way." The file thickened and then, if you were lucky, slowed. Good health is sometimes the absence of new paragraphs. We close the drawer gently. The phone on the wall goes on breathing. The corridor light continues its honest buzzing, an artificial bee that never stings. Outside, the city chooses winter or perhaps late spring. Both are suited to steady improvements. Somewhere a sanatorium bell rings for supper. Somewhere a family plans tea and removes a spare key from a pocket it should not have occupied. Somewhere in a library that smells faintly of pine boards and patience, a book with the title How to Sleep Well by Eating Soup waits for its next borrower, even if the book has never existed and never needed to. You, listening in the half-dark, might feel that easeful tiredness that arrives when a bureaucracy of care has quietly done its job. If you are still awake, you may find a pair of warm socks and the dignity of a glass of water. If you are asleep, excellent. The file will make a note in the morning, in tidy handwriting, that rest occurred on schedule, and the city just a little. Softer than before, will approve the entry with a small, satisfied stamp.